It's really my privilege to welcome all of you today to listen to somebody who I am excited to hear, the director of the Nanovic Institute on day 11 of his tenure at the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. He's served previously for the past 18 months as our interim director. This is Clemens Sedmak. It's been my good fortune to design this program and to be able to bring in speakers that I most want to hear as well. And when we realized that we were going to design this program with Clemens as our director, I asked him if he would be willing to share something to connect our mission and faith life to our work. And this is really one of the ways that we're putting the Catholic into our Catholic leadership program. So today, Clemens is going to speak to us on dignity-based management, a Catholic perspective, a topic which I think he's eminently well qualified to discuss with us today. He has served previously as the F.D. Morris Professor for Moral Theology and Social Theology at King's College London before coming to Notre Dame in about 2016, I think. 2015. And he has doctoral degrees in philosophy, theology, and social theory. Note that was plural doctoral degrees. Doctoris multis, I think, is how the Latin is at this point. And has written a number of books. If you search within the Hesburgh Library, he has 32 books that will come up under his authorship and many more articles. Most notably, I think, as far as titles, is Doing Local Theology, a Guide for Artisans of a New Humanity. And I love that concept of being artisans of a new humanity. He's a gifted teacher, much appreciated by the global affairs students at Notre Dame, where he calls them to be artisans of a new humanity, and perhaps will share some of that with us today. But among all of this, not only is Clemens a gifted scholar, he's also a gifted manager. We have the opportunity to witness that daily at the Nanovic Institute as he shares both his skills as a leader and as a manager. So not just having the vision for where we should go, but how to work with us as a workforce to help us get there in a humane and dignified way. So with that, it's really my pleasure to introduce Professor Clemens Sedmak for Dignity-Based Management, a Catholic Perspective. Thank you, Clemens.
Thank you. Welcome to Notre Dame. We'll go until, let's say, 3 o'clock, then take a short break, and then go until 4, take another break, and see what happens afterwards. As Monica said, the topic is dignity-based management. I have some experience with leading and building institutions, and I'm interested in institutional ethics. So I'm a philosopher by training, as Monica said. I'm interested in institutional ethics. And I would like to cover the following topics today. Where are we speaking from? This doesn't work. Maybe red. Where are we speaking from? Two remarks. 2 examples, that's another 2 remarks. Then the basis, human dignity. Then managing moral goods. And then challenges to human dignity. And then open questions. So that's the menu, so to speak. Where are we speaking from? It's a good question to ask. And the insight came to me when we had the election in November 2016, when Donald Trump was elected president of the US. And some of the students, or many of the students here on campus, were confused, and it was unexpected. And so many people here on campus didn't know how to respond and find the appropriate words. And they asked a colleague of mine, well, what do you say? And he's a lawyer, wonderful person, director of the Kellogg Institute, by the way. He's a lawyer, and he gave very sophisticated legal responses, like, the strength of institutions, democratic elections, and, what a lawyer would say in this situation. But the students kept pressing and said, but you personally, what do you say? And he said, well, I would like to start with this question, where am I speaking from? I am not speaking from a position where I expect final words from politics. I'm not speaking from a position where I know that my well-being depends on the outcome of elections. And that's why I like this question. Where are we speaking from when we talk about management as Catholics? Where are we speaking from? And the one word that comes to my mind here is humility. Humility meaning we know a lot about the limits of management. There's only so much management can do. Some of you may know Michael Sandel's book, What Money Can't Buy. If you know the book. You know the book? You have lived good lives without knowing the book, so why bother? But Michael Sandel, it's called What Money Can't Buy. And in this book, he talks about the most important things in life that money cannot give us. And there are certain things that lose their nature when they are subjected to a commercial model. Friendship, for example, buying friendship, or buying love, or buying time. And it's not in our interest to create markets for everything. Like organ transplantations, you do not want to have a market for that. So there are certain limits to what money can do. And similarly, there are limits to what management can do. There are certain things we can put in place. There are certain structures that we can plan. And there is a lot that cannot be planned. And I give you one example. I did my civil service. I'm from Austria. So in Austria, the male citizens have to do either military service or civil service for 14 months. And I did my civil service in Bhutan in Southeast Asia. And it was a forest project. And the Austrian government funding the project built these little cottages for the employees. And you can plan that. How many employees, how many cottages, you can plan that. The space and the material and the costs. But you cannot plan and anticipate what will happen inside those cottages. And they put one car mechanic and an accountant, he male, she female, together in a cottage. And there are only certain things you can plan. And what happened was they laughed each other, they hated each other, they laughed each other. It was a little problematic for the whole project. Because are they on speaking terms today, or where are we? And so there are limits to what management can do. And sometimes in ethics we say what's really ethically interested is what we cannot really influence. That is this moment of we have to accept what's being given to us. And management has a lot to do with responding to what the situation gives you, what you cannot anticipate and plan. And that gives us a sense of humility. Especially now, as you know, we are ruining our planet. Do you know New Moor Island? New Moor Island in the Gulf of Bengal. So it's an island, and Bangladesh and Pakistan fought about this island, and at some point it was gone. Because of the rising sea levels, it's gone. It's not there anymore. So no use fighting over this island. That was not planned, that was not anticipated, and it just shows there are many things that we cannot manage. Looking at the droughts in California, there are so many things that we cannot manage. So when we think about management from a Catholic perspective, we also know that many things do not depend on us, and that there are long-time consequences of behavior from previous generations and our own generation. So there is this sense of humility. And I think that's very important that as people with leadership responsibilities and management skills, we know that there are limits to what we can do and influence. Humility. Good? Not good? Thank you, Lisa. Cucumber and positive comments, you know, that's our kind of Lisa. The second insight here I would have is discipleship. As Catholics, discipleship, and then Father Pavel talked about that in a brief remark, it's the day of the Lord. So we are here because we are disciples of Christ. That's the idea, to be disciples of Christ. And management as a way of discipleship is something that is not written about a lot. You will not find a lot of literature on that, management as a way of discipleship. My to-go-to text when I think about discipleship are normally the Gospels. And it would be nice homework. I'm not a homework fascist kind of person. But it would be a nice homework to think about which gospel passages would you like to choose when you think about Jesus and management. Jesus and management. Any takers for this question? It's not a homework. Gospel passage, Jesus and management? Sorry? We start with Father Pavel and then we go to Father Yuri.
Okay. You send them in couples to find out something about themselves.
He sent the disciples out as couples, in pairs. Luke 10, yes. And what's the message here?
They were supposed to learn by themselves something about the mission.
By themselves and from themselves, maybe. So not alone. Good point. Father Yuri.
10:45 says that Jesus come do not to be served
Oh, apologies.
and give his life for the others. Mark 10:45 is like the main verse in the whole Gospels, because of he is a like kingly servant in that Gospel. Because when we are talking about Luke, he's a savior. He serves for women, children, outcasts, and so on. In Matthew, he is the one who brings the kingdom. But in Mark's, he serves. He gives our life for. He gives his life for our sake, in the service.
Thank you.
Yes.
And obviously in John 13, when you have the washing of the feet, there's this. Judy. You took mine. Oh, I did not. It's in the gospel. I didn't take it. No. It was there. I come to that in a second. The idea of servant leadership. And there's this discussion, where's the limit of leadership and management, what's the distinction? We can talk about that in a separate discussion. But this idea of those with responsibility for others have to serve the common good. And if you think of the model of the Good Shepherd does not feed himself or herself. That's not the task of the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd is there to serve the flock. And the Good Shepherd will have the whole flock in mind. So we'll come to that when we talk about managing moral goods, the common good. And servant leadership, since 1975, Robert Greenleaf is one of these important branches in the literature on leadership, talking about the leader as a servant who is not out there to maximize his or her own advantage or privilege or reputation, but to serve the institution. Judy.
No, I was going to say, I got upset because I was going to say the washing the feet, but you took it. You said it first. That's all.
And what's the connection between washing of the feet and management?
Well, the line I've given you example, the line I've given you example right there is like the formative part of leadership. So I'm showing you how to do something. And I suppose you could say the same at the Last Supper, actually. I'm sorry, I can't give the quotes of where they are in Scripture, but you know, both are showing example of you know, basically the founding of a church and what Jesus expected of his team, so to speak.
Beautiful. Give you an example. One of my intellectual heroes is Janusz Korczak, Polish famous pediatrician. Janusz Korczak, Korczak. Yeah. So he was this amazing Jewish pediatrician who was called the radio doctor, who talked about children's rights in the 1920s. And Janusz Korczak wrote a number of books, including the book How to Love a Child. And then he ran an orphanage in the Warsaw ghetto. He could have fled at least 2 times, but decided to stay with the children and was killed in a concentration camp. And Janusz Korczak famously said, do not expect something from the children that you have not tried out yourself. Because that's quite common, that you impose something on other people which you would not endure yourself. And the bigger the gap between the teacher and the student, or the leader and those who work with the leader, the bigger this problem or the bigger the risk that this is not being considered. I like Matthew 14 as an example of Jesus and management, the feeding of the 5,000. It's this scene. Jesus finds out about the death of John the Baptist, and he wants to be alone. So he goes to this deserted place. And then the crowd follow him. And then Jesus sees the crowd, and instead of getting upset, he has compassion on the crowd. Then he heals the sick. And then it's getting late, and his disciples tell Jesus, well, send them home. It's late. And Jesus says, they don't have to go away. You have to feed them, he tells the disciples. And the disciples says, well, how can we feed so many people? And Jesus asks them to sit down in groups, so he puts order to the situation. And then they collect what they have, bread and fish. And through sharing, there is enough for everybody. Jesus giving grace and thanking God for the gifts. And then they collect the leftovers. And just from a management perspective, there is this sense of, number one, the capacity to be alone. I do not think that you can be a good leader if you cannot be alone and ask the big questions and do your thorough thinking. I once spent a week at the Adenauer house at Lake Como in Italy. So Konrad Adenauer, the former Chancellor of Germany, used to spend his summers there in a nice villa, as you can imagine, overlooking Lake Como, where he could ask the big questions and not just the little busy everyday life challenges. So the capacity to be alone is something that has to be cultivated. It's not just a sacrifice, it's a capacity. Donald Winnicott wrote a famous essay in '58, The Capacity to Be Alone, where creativity has a lot to do with this ability to spend time with yourself. Spend time with yourself. So Jesus spends time with himself, and as you know, in Matthew 14, after he had fed the crowd, again he tried to be by himself on top of a mountain. So there's this sense of you have to have your own space. From a Catholic perspective, you have to have your contemplative life, you have to have your inner space, you have to cultivate that. And then Jesus sees the crowd. So this attention, this openness to reality. Thomas Aquinas famously called stupidity a person who is numb in his or her senses. You're not open to reality. The stupid person is not open to reality. So this attention, you see the crowd. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, you also have this scene where the Samaritan sees the victim of the robbers. Sees. It comes to mind. And then Jesus is moved, compassion. So management has a lot to do with responding to what the situation gives you. And you are right there in the moment. And compassion means you have, in modern terms, emotional intelligence. I don't like the term too much, but it just means you can connect to people. You can connect to people, you can understand where they are coming from. And Jesus has compassion. And then he cures the sick. If you can do that, that's a competitive advantage, to be honest. And I remember John Cassian saying, if we could work miracles, we didn't do so many sermons. That's clever. You know, if we had the power to do miracles, we wouldn't have to preach so much. And Jesus cured the sick. So management has something to do with you have skills and abilities. And you all, A, have leadership responsibilities, and B, have worked with leaders and managers. And you can distinguish those who blah, 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 and those who have real skills. And so in this little passage, you see Jesus has real skills. And these skills are obvious and are demonstrable. I mean, people can realize that Jesus has those skills. And then Jesus basically asks his disciples, you have to feed them, which is a huge way of asking too much from them. I mean, I can just imagine disciples saying, the voice of reason is send them home. It's getting late, there is no food around here, there is no supermarket, send them home. And Jesus refuses to send them home because that's the cheapest and easy way, send them home. And he says to the disciples, well, you have to feed them. And maybe that's also a management skill to ask a lot from the people you work with. There's the fine line between asking too much, but do you know, I shouldn't ask those questions, but yeah. Regina Rawlinson's book, A Mind Shaped by Poverty. It's not a famous book. Regina Rawlinson is or was a teacher working with low-income children. And she herself comes from a family with 14 children, grew up in bitter poverty. Then she was a teacher in a school with poor children, and then she became the principal of this school. And after that, she wrote a book, A Mind Shaped by Poverty. What does it mean to teach children who have deprived childhoods? And one of her insights is expect a lot from these children. Because these children are used to, well, nobody thinks that I'm capable of doing anything. So I'm constantly underestimated. And tell them, I expect a lot from you. I will support you, I will mentor you, I will accompany you, but I will expect a lot from you. Expect a lot. And that's what Jesus did to his disciples. I expect a lot from you. Feed the crowds. She also says, by the way, give them space to express their frustration and anger. Because they will come to school and they will be hugely frustrated. That's another thing. I mean, when you, let's say you're a teacher and you come into the classroom and you just know what the teaching that happens now is not the first thing that happens on this day. It's clearly not the first thing that happened in the life of the children. And they come with a lot of baggage into the classroom. And there is a lot of terrible baggage. And you're not responsible for that. but you harvest something that others have sown, parents and dysfunctional family relations, and you harvest that. And that's also part of this management, being able not to take things too personally, just in brackets. So that's Regina Rawlinson, very close to Jesus, saying, I expect a lot from you. And then Jesus asks the crowd to sit down in groups. So he organizes that. He brings order to the situation. Management has a lot to do with bringing order to a situation. So this room is well designed right now with our seating order, and this had to be designed, order. And then Jesus, and that's part of the humility, asks in a prayerful mode God for support, and that's an important management idea. It does not depend on us. We are, that's a Gandhi quote, we are lords in the reign of effort, but not lords in the reign of success. And I'm sure there's a gender-just way of expressing that, but we can work very hard. But whether we are successful or not, this is not up to us. Here in Notre Dame, we had in-person classes the full last academic year, in-person classes in spite of the pandemic. And we had, Grant remind me, maybe 8,000 cases. We had many cases on campus. It was constantly monitored. Julie, you may remember that. I think it was 8,000 cases and not a single death. And maybe only a handful cases in the hospital. And I mean, you can draw many conclusions from that. But my conclusion is, thanks to God's grace, we did not lose a person. And we prayed every day for this not to happen, thanks to God's grace. And Notre Dame did everything in terms of safety protocol and safety measures. I mean, amazing and impressive, but there's only so much you can do in terms of efforts, and then it does not depend on you. And that's also, it's humbling, but at the same time also a liberating experience. It does not depend on you. So Jesus asks God, and then he manages the resources. He takes stock of the resources. We have bread and we have fish. And then he manages those resources by distributing these resources, having established order. And then he manages the leftovers of the resources as well. So you can take a lot out of this very short passage. And there are many passages. And that's just homework in the weeks or months to come if you're interested. Looking at the gospel and thinking about Jesus and management. You can think about Jesus and leadership. You can also think about Jesus and management, how Jesus dealt with time. And Matthew 14 continues with the disciples are in a storm and they are worried and afraid. And also Jesus, in a sense, abandons them. A little bit like what Father Paul said about the pairs of disciples who are sent off. And quite often when Jesus heals a person, Jesus says to the person, now go away. I mean, go your way and you are healed now. So, which is an important message here. So this is my first point. Where are we speaking from? Humility and discipleship. Any comments? Good. Now here, before we come to examples, a definition of management. Definition of management, there are so many definitions of management that it's a little disconcerting. Management. So I have a very simple suggestion. Very simple suggestion of management. Management is the coordination of processes and practices to achieve, that's an A, specific and explicit goals. Coordination of processes and practices to achieve specific and explicit goals. Can you read that? Achieve. Can you read that? If not, does it matter? If you know what it means, you can read it. Coordination of processes and practices to achieve specific and explicit goals. Good? If we accept it, just for the time being, we can make 4 observations. Number 1, coordination. Management has a lot to do with seeing the stakeholders. Seeing the stakeholders. And for example, if you have a classroom, you don't manage students, you manage families. Because the whole family is in the classroom, invisibly so. We also say if you put one person in prison, a whole family is in prison. If one person is in hospital, a whole family is in hospital. So coordination means you see the stakeholders, also the invisible stakeholders, the indirect stakeholders, because they play an important role in the processes that you need to manage. Coordination also means to see things from different perspectives. So Aquinas, I like Aquinas. As a Catholic, you have not to be ashamed of liking Aquinas, right? So Aquinas defines prudence as circumspectio, as the ability to look around something, to look at something from different perspectives. So management means you have a kind of overview. You have a sense of the whole, so to speak. That's a part of this coordination. Coordination also means to allow people to develop. So again, coming back to Luke 10 and what Father Pavel said about Jesus sent off the disciples in pairs, well, so that they learn by themselves. That's what you said. So they are, in a sense, on their own. Management has a lot to do with open space, enabling conversations. It's not so much that you do all the things. It's more about allowing people to develop their skills and seeing the possibilities. There's a beautiful book by Benjamin Zender called The Art of Possibility. Benjamin Zender is an orchestra conductor, Benjamin, and he and his wife Rosalind wrote a book on leadership, and the book is called The Art of Possibility. And his point here is, if you are in charge of a group of people, you have to constantly see the possibilities that are there. And he tells an anecdote. They were about to perform on the evening Schubert's Winter, is it Winter Traveler, Winter Journey in English? Lisa, okay. Die Winterreise, Schubert's Winterreise, whatever it is. And one of the main protagonists of the orchestra told him, well, I cannot perform tonight, my girlfriend just left me. And Benjamin Zender, we just talked about marriage and priests. And so the girlfriend just left me. And he said, well, I didn't know what to say. On the one hand, I felt sorry for the guy. It may take a while to find the next girlfriend and the one after that. Anyway, on the other hand, I thought this is great, because if you are lovesick, that's the perfect frame of mind to perform Schubert's Winterreise, because there's this melancholy that comes with that. And yes, Winter Journey. Lisa, thank you so much for browsing the internet instead of listening to me. I appreciate it. It's great. Schubert's Winter Journey. And he said, that's perfect. That's what we need, a lovesick guy to perform well in the concert. So he saw the possibility. And that's part of this very simple word, coordination. You see the possibility, and the gut reaction of when something goes wrong is not, oh, shit, but what's the opportunity that we have now? What's the opportunity? Or as my friend and colleague Maji Fail likes to say, what's the invitation? What is the invitation in this situation? So coordination, as a very simple, seemingly simple term in management, you coordinate people and processes and practices. So things have to come together. Observation number 2, processes. You coordinate processes. And processes, by definition, change all the time. Aristotle, I also like Aristotle, which is also in the Catholic world, it's all right to like Aristotle, as long as you don't like him more than Aquinas. That's a problem. So Aristotle talked about management, in his own terms, in the sphere of practice. So when we do management, we do that in what he called the sphere of practice. And the sphere of practice has 3 characteristics. It changes all the time. Practice changes all the time. The light, the temperature, the clouds change all the time. That is why, secondly, it cannot be fully exhausted by analysis. You can never fully analyze any situation. While you analyze it, it changes already. And thirdly, you only encounter particulars, not the general or the universal in practice. So management means you work in a sphere of practice where things change all the time. You deal with processes where you cannot fully analyze any given situation, and you only deal with particulars. In the textbooks, you may find case studies, but then you find general concepts. This is a general concept. That's why it's not really sexy and exciting. It's a general, boring concept of management using general terms. We will not encounter that in practice, only particulars. And when we coordinate processes, it means there's only so much, bring me back to this humility part, of what we can predict, anticipate, and plan, and many things that cannot be planned. And in project management, we know you have effects that are planned and effects that are not planned. You have effects that are desired and you have effects that are not desired. And sometimes you have non-planned, non-desired effects. It would be stupid to have planned non-desired effects, but some people are stupid. But maybe not people, but some planning processes are stupid. So when I was in Bhutan, Bhutan is a matrilineal country where the husbands are employees at the farms of their wives. And so the mother gives the farm over to the daughter, who then employs her husband. And then this Austrian project came in, and that was in the 1990s. And I think they meant well. I mean, Austria is not a prestigious country, as you know, and people are stupid. But they meant well. But they created 100 jobs in a forest project, 95 of which went to men, as in male human beings, and 5 to female human beings. And then the gender structure changed because the men could make much more money working 8 hours in the Austrian forest project than working for their wives in the fields. And this was unplanned and frankly undesired and stupid. But this is part of you manage processes where you have to be flexible all the time. Like Jesus in Matthew 14, he was not planning to cure the sick or preach to the crowd or feed the crowd. He wasn't planning on that. He wanted to be alone. He had just received the message, your friend John the Baptist had died, was killed cruelly. And so you want to be alone in this situation. And he was flexible enough process. Which also means, as Monica and Grant know very well, I'm not a perfectionist, with all the terrible things that come with that truth. But it has certain advantages. Because if you're a perfectionist, processes will never be perfect. Processes will never be perfect. And that is why Aquinas, did I mention Aquinas already? I did not, right? So Aquinas, just to mention him at least once in this talk, Aquinas talked about magnanimity as a very important human attitude, if not a virtue. And magnanimity is a beautiful Latin word. My daughter, when she was 7 years old, asked me, do you have a favorite Latin word? That says a lot about her childhood, doesn't it? And I even had an answer to this question. Magnanimitas is my favorite Latin word, magnanimity. It means to have a big heart that can deal without getting stressed out with conflicts, contradictions, tensions. You can accommodate different ideas without getting nervous. So it is not compatible with narrow-mindedness. And when you manage processes, narrow-mindedness, having only one way of how things should go, is not helpful, because things will not go the way you have planned them. By definition, they can't. So magnanimity is this sense of, well, I had planned A, now we are there in stage B, and I can live with that without getting stressed out or being too nervous about it. And those of you who have children, well, children are processes in human shape, in a sense, right? I mean, they're also ticking time bombs, beautiful. But you cannot control children. You cannot control children. You can control books. Sometimes people tell me, you know, a book is a child, you cannot control it, a child. And I say that's stupid. You know, when I know, you know, I have 6 chapters to write and I have 15,000 words per chapter, I can do that. Anyway, processes. Good, processes. Any perfectionists here? Recovering perfectionist? I mean, Grant is a father of 2 boys, and I mean, I guess that's helpful. Beautiful boys, of course. But you know, and now Grant works at the Nanovic Institute, which is great, but far from perfect. And he works with me, the opposite of perfect. So, yeah. Father Pavel, perfectionist. So that's yeah. So there is this also generosity with oneself. Because what sometimes happens is that people who are perfectionists are very mild towards others, but expect a lot from themselves. There is a letter from Ignatius of Loyola. I like Ignatius of Loyola. I cannot say that too loud here on campus. We should quote Holy Cross priests. But, you know, there's only so much you can get from Holy Cross priests. So Ignatius of Loyola, you know who I'm talking about? Yes. Great guy, right? Yes. Great guy, full stop. He was an excellent manager and an excellent leader and built the structure of the Society of Jesus in the 16th century in a way that it's still by and large the same today. That's impressive. And he started with 7 individuals, and when he died, there were 1,000 Jesuits working in 17 different countries. So that's impressive. Ignatius of Loyola had one problem with a perfectionist Dutch provincial, Caspar Bercy. That was his name, Father Caspar Bercy, who was the provincial in India, if I'm not mistaken. And he worked so hard that he ruined his health. And he was almost proud of that. And Ignatius of Loyola, the superior general of the Jesuits, sent him a short, very stern letter saying, I hear that you are ruining your health. You have no right to do so. Because, 2 reasons. Number 1, if you ruin your health, you cannot serve the kingdom of God in the long run. And basically, you have no right to shortchange God. Number 2, if a person is too harsh with himself or herself, this person will probably be too harsh with others. So basically, learn to be more generous with yourself. If you don't learn that, I have to appoint a superior who is subject to his provincial in all questions, but in questions of your own health. Yeah, that was in 1554, 2 years before Ignatius died. That says a lot about these processes, generosity, being flexible and allowing things to develop in a way that you have not anticipated and not seeing that as a threat. Practices. Alistair McIntyre, does that ring a bell? Alistair McIntyre? Yes. Yesterday? Yes, Alistair McIntyre is 92 years old. He's a philosopher. He's here in Notre Dame. He works in Geddes Hall. He comes to the office at least once a week. And he wrote a book in 1981, After Virtue. And in this book, he gives this famous definition of practices. And you don't have to write it down. I mean, you can, of course. But the gist is more important. Practices are complex forms of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized according to standards of excellence. That's the definition of a practice according to McIntyre. So practices are complex forms of socially established cooperative behavior. Socially established, there has to be a structure, a tradition, something where people know there are rules to the game, there are rules, and people recognize those rules as rules. And it's very important that people are clear about the rules. That's why when I teach, I like to tell students we go from 1:30 to 2:15 or something, that there is clarity. Toxic stress is stress that comes from, I don't know what's happening next. And there's a book by Bowen Powley, an American anthropologist, who worked 3 years in a very, very difficult school in the Bronx and then 3 years in a very, very difficult school near Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And the book is called Toxic Schools. And he talks about the toxic stress in those schools, characterized by you're a teacher and you have no idea what will happen in the next moment. There could be a rock flying at you. There could be a student committing suicide, jumping out of the window. There could be a student stabbing another student in the back row. I mean, all these things could happen and did happen during his 6 years. And that's toxic stress, when you just do not know what will happen next. So that's why it's so important that people know there are rules. And management means you establish the rules and people are clear about the rules, socially established, cooperative form of activity. And cooperative means, well, we have to work together. Many expeditions fail because people are not willing and able to work together. There's a beautiful book by Don Schminke and Chris Warner on the Himalayan expeditions. As you know, so many people want to climb the Mount Everest, and 73% of the expeditions fail. And maybe now even more because so many people are, And they looked at the reasons why basically 3/4 of the attempts to reach the summit of Mount Everest fail. And one reason is the lonely hero. And the reason is that some expeditions do not work well together. You do want, one person in the team wants to be the hero, the first on the summit or not depending on others, and this person then endangers all the others. Another reason, by the way, is seduction by technique. Seduction by technique, sometimes the very well-equipped expeditions fail. There's a beautiful sentence in this book, and the sentence is, a fool with a tool is still a fool. Meaning just that this fool now has a tool, But then you rely on the tool rather than on your own judgment. And given what we said about Aristotle and the sphere of practice, you need to be able to make judgments because you only encounter particulars. When you manage processes, you do not encounter the general. So practices are these complex forms of socially established cooperative human activity that realize goods that are internal to this activity. And these are important questions to ask. If you manage something, what are the criteria of success? What are the criteria of success? What are the goods that you want to produce? So in a teaching context, like here in Notre Dame, what is the good that teaching a course wants to produce? Is it that the students are happy? Is it that the students learn a lot? Which is not always the same. There's an overlap, but it's not always the same. Is it that the parents are happy? Is it that the donors are happy? Is it that the dean is happy? I mean, there are different criteria. And you can say, well, I want to check all these boxes. But you may have to set priorities. It's a little bit like what's the good of playing soccer? Is it to win the game? Is it not to lose the game? Is it to play beautiful soccer? Is it to have fun? Is it to make a lot of money? And if you're a football coach or a soccer coach, a lot depends on your style, what you define as the goods that soccer needs to produce. And formerly, Italian soccer was famous for we just want to defend, and then we want to score by 0-0, and 1-0 is good enough for us. Because it's true, at the end of the game, like today, at the end of the game, yeah, this one. Anyway, but that's an important question. What are the goods that you want to produce? So whenever you run something, that's a good question to ask. What are the goods that the practices that you try to manage seek to realize? And there is a big difference between happy students and students who are benefiting from the course. There is a difference. Sometimes the difference is small, but it's a different, pleasing the students is a different approach to the good that you try to get out of the education process or practice than having students who learn something. Especially if you teach a course where they really need to know something afterwards. So if you train medical doctors, so I teach philosophy, and who cares, right? I mean, if they cannot quote Alistair's definition of practices, it will not be a life-threatening thing. I don't think so. But if you train future medical doctors and you don't tell them exactly, they need to know something. Whether they're happy with that or not, you need to know that. And I teach integral human development here in the Q School, and as you know, this is a concept created in Catholic social tradition, and I tell them, I don't care whether you're interested in that or not, you need to know the Catholic social tradition behind the concept, because that's where the concept comes from. This is a Catholic university, and there's no excuse, not for me, not for you, and so it's not for me to make you happy with the concept. It's practices, okay? According to standards of excellence. So practices are those complex forms of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized according to standards of excellence. And according to standards of excellence means, well, by which standards? There was a project in Germany looking at homilies of priests. And then the question is, well, what is a good homily? And then you can have a theological discussion on this very question. Is it a homily where people feel that they understood it? Is it a homily that is orthodox? Is it a homily that decides to talk about the scripture of the day? I don't like homilies that talk about everything but the scripture of the day. Anyway, different story. But it's not clear what are the standards of excellence. Even if we know what the goods are that we want to produce, the standards of excellence are still another question that we can debate. Even if we say the good of the homily is, let's say, the spiritual edification of the believers. What are the standards of excellence of spiritual edification? Is it to tell them about heaven or is it to tell them about hell? I mean, I'm exaggerating it, but you know what I'm trying to say here. So this means the practices, okay? Good. And then achieve specific and explicit goals. Specific goals, goals that are clearly defined, always helpful, clearly defined goals. People in hierarchically structured systems are very often frustrated because the goals are not clearly defined and communicated. And I had a lovely conversation with one of our donors, lovely, but nonetheless not very helpful, because I asked him, well, what would you like us to do? And he said, do it well. I said, well, thanks, but no thanks. So specific. And in our strategic plan, that I'm working on behind your back, Grant and Monica, by the way. We will try to have specific goals for the next 5 years, and not just these vague goals we want to, have fun with great people like you, Eminence. And explicit goals that people can really refer to the goal and understand what it's about. So this is a management definition in a nutshell. And the goals, if you look at processes that are flexible, the goals may have to be changed. Do you remember Ernest Shackleton's famous expedition, the Transantarctic expedition from 1914? I wasn't there, but I read about it. And what happened was that in January 1915, the famous ship of Ernest Shackleton and his 27 people on board got caught in the ice. The name of the ship was Endurance. It's a famous story. It was caught in the ice in January 1915. And then they hoped that when the spring would come later in the year, they would get out of the ice, which was not the case. When the spring came, the ship was basically flooded with all the water. That was in October. So they had spent basically 10 months doing, I don't know what you do with 27 men on a ship. You cannot even play soccer. So that was difficult enough. So then they had to abandon the ship. He made the decision, the very difficult decision, a management decision to abandon the ship in October 1915. And then they arrived at Elephant Island, which was not inhabitable, and they knew they would not survive just staying there. And then, and that was already in early 1916. And then in April 1916, he decided to take a very, very dangerous route to ask for help at one of the whaling stations, 4 weeks trip. And then in August 1916, he rescued the 22 men who were still waiting on Elephant Island. It's a famous story because Ernest Shackleton, when he set out for the expedition, had a very clear goal: Transantarctic expedition from A to B. Then he had to change the goal because of the situation he found himself in. The goal was now rescue the 27 men who are entrusted to you. And he did not lose a single person. It's Ernest Shackleton. Ernest Shackleton. And it's part of this idea of being generous and flexible because you deal with processes that you adapt the goals. It's a little bit like the health definition of Leonard Nordenfeld. Leonard Nordenfeld defines health, and you can apply it to a healthy institution if you want. Health is a second-order capability of dealing with your capabilities and limits in a way that you can reach important life goals. A person is healthy if she or he can realize important life goals given his or her capabilities and limits. So I have classes. An important life goal for me is being able to read. By Leonard Nordenfeld's definition, I'm a healthy person because I can still achieve my life goal of reading. By the WHO's definition, I'm not healthy because I have a kind of physical impairment, right? Because I have to wear glasses. Now, if you want to be healthy, you can do two things. You can try to have technological support to achieve your life goals, or what's the second option? You can change your life goals. So if people have a car accident and they are wheelchair bound, they will have to change their life goals. And by Leonard Nordenfeld's definition, they can still be healthy. And that's in a healthy institution, that could happen as well. So obviously last year was very difficult for the whole university because pandemic meant, and Judy and Lisa know that, we love to send students and faculty to other places. Nanovic Institute to Europe. We love to host people from Europe. This was not possible because of the pandemic, and then we had to adapt our goals plus the criteria of success. So this is my little definition. Any comments on that? Any footnotes, comments, questions, complaints? Good?
Is it possible to keep the goal with changing some possibilities around it?
Oh yeah.
To keep the goal?
I mean, I like to distinguish between the big goal and the smaller goals. It's like espérance and espoir in French. I can say the big goal is, let's say that we are faithful to our mission. The smaller goals, maybe we teach this course to achieve the mission, and we have this program to achieve the mission, and then we drop this course because it will not be possible to teach it. We cannot have visitors. Something like you can, I think, change the small goals as long as the big goal is kept in mind, which is part, I think, of this discipleship question. It's so important to ask the big question: what do we want to do with our lives, and what's the point of our lives? And it's a very, very important insight that the Sabbath serves the human person and not the other way around as we read in the gospel. Meaning institutions serve the human person who serve God, but we do not serve the institution. The church in the institutionalized form is a means to an end, but not the end in itself. Any institute, the Nanovic Institute, I love the Nanovic Institute, but I should not depend in my salvation on the Nanovic Institute. And there's also this sense of, if you are willing to die, you have a certain inner freedom, and you can transfer the same idea to institutions. So as you know, there are a number of Catholic orders struggling with the future, and new members and new sisters and new brothers and new priests, and some of them are closing down. And I remember Timothy Radcliffe, the former superior of the Dominicans, writing about how he met Irish nuns of a very small order. And they were basically dying out. I mean, no young women interested in joining the order. And the nun looked at him and said, but God cannot possibly want us to die as an order. And Timothy Radcliffe wrote, I looked at her and said, well, I just know he permitted that his son died. Meaning, yes, it could happen. And I think there's an inner liberation if you manage an institution and you try to do your best, don't get me wrong. But the inner liberation if it's not the worst that can happen if this institution comes to an end. When I was in my teens, I was very interested in the missionaries of Africa, the so-called white fathers at the time. And they were founded in the 19th century in North Africa, did a lot to abolish, overcome slavery in North Africa, Cardinal Lavigerie. And now, of course, they have similar challenges as many other orders. And one friend of mine from the Missions of Africa said, I would like to see it this way. We had an important role to play. If the Missions of Africa come to an end in the 21st century, so be it. And a number of religious orders invest a lot of energy and resources in keeping themselves alive and afloat. And that's also a question of where are your priorities? What is the big goal? And coming back to your question, yes, you can make adjustments of the small goals. Of course, you can also make adjustments to some ways of wording the goal, making it less explicit or more explicit. But you need to be very clear about the big goal. And if you're clear about the big goal as an individual and as an institutional leader, it's quite liberating. Good?
If you can do that, if there is not someone else who is telling you what the goal should be, and he's not happy if the small goal is changing because you are in position to follow the big goal and he doesn't see the situation like that.
Yeah, that's unavoidable. Yeah. That you may. I mean, let me say three things, if I may. One is the big distinction between deontic authority and epistemic authority. Do you know that? Those who have not yet fallen asleep? Yes, I see it all. So, epistemic and deontic authority. It's a definition by Joseph Bocheński, the Polish Swiss philosopher, in his book on what is authority. It's a very simple but very insightful distinction. Epistemic authority is authority based on knowledge and skill and episteme. Deontic authority is authority based on your status in the hierarchy. And it can be a source of frustration if you are inferior in a hierarchy, have higher epistemic authority than the one who is in charge, who has higher deontic authority but is an idiot. And happens. I mean, that's unfortunately, it does happen. That you find yourself in a constellation where because if you have a person who is, you report to another person who shares a similar epistemic authority with you, you can talk with this person, you can have a reasonable conversation, and you can talk about the values. And there may still be disagreements. As we know, Cardinal Lehmann and John Paul II, they had their disagreements, and they were still, I mean, equally disciples of Christ, etc., etc. But there is a basis. And what I want to say here is one of the challenges. One of the key points in management is give people reasons. Give people reasons so that people can understand where you are coming from. But these constellations, Father Pavel, in my experience, are unavoidable and frustrating. I know, right. And if you have larger deontic authority than epistemic, you frustrate others. And we had our share of bishops in Austria. I said, oops, oops. Anyway, it's always easy to talk about bishops if you're not a bishop yourself, but I would like to be a bishop, but nobody. Anyway, good. So that's my definition. Any other comments or footnotes? Management as the coordination of processes and practices to achieve specific and explicit goals. And then we made some observations. So 2 examples, a negative and a positive example. And we'll have a short break in 27 minutes, just that you know what's happening. The negative example is the Mid-Staffordshire scandal in England in the 2009. Mid-Staffordshire hospital scandal. What happened was, between 2005 and 2009, between 400 and 1,200 people died unnecessarily in this hospital. That's a lot. We call these excess deaths. Mid-Staffordshire hospital scandal. What happened was, the National Health Service in England is notoriously underfunded, and the government pushes them to meet certain financial goals and targets. And that's another issue, if you inherit goals which you did not formulate yourself. And what happened was they exercised a lot of pressure on the hospital to save money. By the way, one strategy to save money was to put highly salaried managers in place to kick out other people. Do you know this dynamic? The divide between university administrators who kick out other people and normal people who do the real work. I mean, it's great. So there were a shortage of personnel, and what happened was they were just, at first they had the phenomenon of moral stress. It is stressful if you cannot perform on the level that you would like to perform. At some point you just give up. And they gave up. And patients were not fed. Patients were not given a drink. Patients were fed. So for example, if Oksana cannot move and you put the food here, she has no chance to eat it. And that's what happened in this hospital. Family members found their wives and husbands and fathers and mothers in their excrements, soiled in the bed sheets that were not changed. I mean, it was just horrible. And people died unnecessarily. 4 years. Many complaints that were not heard. And the result was the so-called Francis Report, which is online, and I can share the resource if you're interested in. And the Francis Report looked into that and said what happened was the well-being of patients was put secondary or tertiary, and the financial goals were the #1 goals. And that's a question of that, if you remember, practices, the goods. What are the goods that the hospital needs to produce? Is it cost-saving measures? They would say, well, life is cost and ends with death at some point, so why invest anyway, right? Which is a stupid logic. And so a hospital is not there to save money. I don't believe in for-profit hospitals, as I don't believe in for-profit prisons, things like that. So what happened here was financial targets were defined by managers, and the practitioners, the nurses and doctors, had no chance to meet those targets, and then they just gave up. And we had interviews with National Health Service, NHS employees, and they talked about the 2 cultures, the management culture and the culture of those who do the work. And that's a big challenge in any system, where you have a managerial culture. They define the targets, they monitor, they ask the others what to do. They tell the others what to do, but they have no idea what it means. And I'll give you a very, very simple example. Teachers in Austria have to teach a certain amount of hours per week. Let's say it's 26 hours. And then, of course, you could save a lot of money if you made each teacher teach 28 instead of 26 hours per week. And if you look at that, sitting at the desk, you may say that's reasonable, but you have no idea how much work, additional work it is to teach 2 extra hours. What we do to our priests these days in Austria and everywhere, we say, you have 4 parishes now. Well, you can take 6, right? What's the difference between 4 and 6? And we have no idea what it means for the priest or for the idea of ministry and salvation of souls. And that's where the managerial culture, that's elitist, that's quite often also in different buildings, in different suites, protected by secretarial staff, etc., call the shots, and others have to do the work. And there's this gap between understanding what it means. I give you an example from King's College London. And again, these people are not necessarily stupid, and they often mean well, but they can create impossible situations. So at King's College London, we got the order that each student is entitled to a 20 minutes tutorial for each submitted essay. And on the surface, that's good. Well-being of students, that's the most important goal of King's College London. Even though the tuition cannot be compared with Notre Dame's tuition, different story. Have you ever talked with a student about a, let's say, 2,500 words essay for 20 minutes? That's long. And normally, there's not so much to say about it. And then, at that point, I taught a class with 60 students who had to submit 2 essays each. Now, you do the maths. 120 times 20, and that's one of the 2 courses which I taught. But this was the order from the managerial culture at King's College London, the overpaid managers. And what do you do at your level? You have a guerrilla tactic. The guerrilla tactic means you try to protect yourself. So what I did, I told the students, you have 10-minute slots that you can sign up for. If you need 20, yes, you can have 20, but I recommend 10. And I made them go to my office door to put the name in handwriting, because no, computer easy, I don't do that. Just walk to my office in the 4th floor of the building, just to reduce the number of those who would do that. But that's not good for the culture. So this idea of the 2 cultures, the management culture and those who do the work, is a big challenge in a hospital, in a university, in a school, in the government, wherever. Where we come back to Janusz Korczak, have you walked in those feet, in those shoes? Do you know what you're asking from them? And similarly with as I said, in our dioceses, it's not good if one priest has 6 parishes. It's not good. That's a negative example. The 2 cultures. And I think that the lesson to be learned here is don't ask from other people what you have not tried yourself. And even if you have tried it yourself, be aware of your level of privilege. Level of privilege. And by level of privilege, I mean this. I know many of my academic colleagues who work 60+ hours a week. And for me, that's in academic work, that's standard. I would never hire an academic who says, well, I do only 40 hours per week. In an academic position where you want to, on a tenure track. Just, anyway. But they have privileged lives. And I remember a conversation with the Minister of Finance at the time in Austria, who said, I work hard and I expect the unemployed people to work as hard as I do. If I work hard, why can't they? And I tried to tell him, I'm sure you work hard, but you eat well, and you have a nice apartment, and you have a nice bed, and it's calm. Poor people have noisy apartments. They are moist. They are dusty. If they can never come to some kind of rest. So if you cannot rest at night, your whole quality of life is really going down. Very, very simple. And yes, you work hard. And you might expect others to work as hard, but for some people, it's a big achievement to come to work at 6:30 in the morning. It's a big achievement. And the pandemic taught us a lot about the distinction between essential and non-essential. Essential workers were probably not those sitting in warm offices, but those who made the university operations run. And when we had extremely cold temperatures 2 years ago, I think in January, the university closed down the campus, but the dining hall workers still had to come in, because somebody has to feed the students. So that's my first example. Negative. The positive example is the Benedictines. Let's say something positive about the Benedictines. Yes, why not the Benedictines? The Benedictines. Benedictines. There are many beautiful things that we can learn about management looking at the Rule of Benedict. There are also some books. And it's a treasure chest. And if you have not done so, you can really just read carefully the Rule of Benedict from a management perspective. It says so much about how to manage a community, how to manage an institution in the long run. Because Benedictine monasteries are here to stay. And there is a well-known study by two economists, Swiss economists, Emil Inauen and Bruno Frey, and it's on the economic resilience and success of Benedictine monasteries. Economic resilience and success. So they were economists. They did not try to do any favors to the Benedictines. They just looked at that, with this sober outlook of economists looking at the economic performance of these monasteries, and they said the Benedictine monasteries are amazingly economically successful, probably for 4 reasons. And the big reason is good governance, good management. And the 4 reasons that are built into the Rule of Benedict are recruiting. In the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, and as you know, the Rule of Benedict is early 6th century, they were very careful in whom to admit and whom not to admit. And it took years for a young man to be admitted to a Benedictine monastery. Recruiting. They would not just take anyone. And up to now, it's a very important insight, even if you have not many applicants, and even if you're worried of filling positions, before you fill the position with a candidate where you are really not sure, don't do it. So recruiting, number 1. Take your time with recruiting, which goes back to our little point about having idiots in leadership positions. It's a shame. It's a shame and could be avoided. Which of course also says something about who is eligible for certain positions. If the pool is too small by default, I mean, that's another issue. Number 1 reason. Number 2 reason, division of labor. As you know, in a Benedictine monastery, you have the abbot, you have the prior, you have the celerarius, you have the guest master, you have the novice master. You have a clear division of labor. The abbot is responsible ad extra, the prior is responsible ad intra, and that helps. Clear rules, clear division of labor. Second rule. The second reason. The third reason is a common value system. Because the rule, the regula, is not just a rule that you learn by heart. It's a rule that you live. It's habits that you live day in and day out. And then if you're part of a monastery for 10 years before you're fully admitted, you live the rule and then you share the value system without you even noticing it. And things are so much easier if the value system is shared. It's so much easier if the value system is shared, because then you don't have to have these fundamental discussions. You can still have discussions, but at least if the big things, I mean, if we have to discuss whether Jesus was fully divine and fully human or not, this, just don't go there. We take this as our point of departure, and then we start there, for example. So maybe 5 reasons. The 4th one is participation. The Rule of Benedict is very clear in decisions that concern the whole monastery. Everybody needs to be consulted, and the youngest monks should speak first. The youngest monks should speak first because at the time, which was before we invented universities like this, young people were shy, and if those who had more experience in life would say something, the young people would not say anything. Yeah. We don't have this here. I once had a student, just in brackets, from California, of course from California, and he was 20 years old at the time and decided to travel to a Benedictine monastery in France to meet an 85-year-old Benedictine who had spent 65 years of his life in the monastery. And he said, and then I will ask him, you tell me about your spiritual life, I will tell you about mine, and then we will both learn from each other. Okay, yeah. No, I'm sure that 20-year-old Californians have a lot to say about their spiritual lives and all that, but humility, important point. Yeah, we talked about that. Anyway, the youngest monks are encouraged to speak first. Participation. And so good management means make sure that everybody has a voice, and especially those who are maybe not willing or encouraged to say something, you need to walk the extra mile and make an extra effort. And the last reason that they mention here under good governance is external control. Every 5 years, any Benedictine monastery has a visitation from the outside, and then you have from the Benedictine Confederation at least 3 visitors who look at the finances, who look at the spiritual well-being, who look at the structure. And as you know, totalitarian regimes don't like to have external control. North Korea comes to mind. You don't like that. But it's a sign of a good and well-managed institution if you have this overview from the outside. So these are two examples, a negative one and a positive one. The negative one is the two cultures where the managerial ethos is basically running away from the operational level. And a good example of Benedictines, where you have the clear division of labor, the clear value system, you have careful recruiting, participation, and external control. Any comments? Good? Human dignity. 247. Can we talk for 13 minutes about human dignity? Yes? No? How many introverts do we have here in this group? Monica's an introvert. I know Monica. Yes. Lisa's an introvert.
Oh, definitely not.
She tries to disguise it very hard, but she's an introvert. Yes. Human dignity. What's the justification for human dignity in our Christian tradition? Image of God. Human person created in the image and likeness of God. And that's a beautiful justification. And it solves so many problems. And let's say it takes care of so many questions, because then you don't have to look at intelligence, capability level, color of skin, whatever, gender. You don't have to look at these things, right? It's every human being, image and likeness of God. This is what I call the vertical dimension of human dignity in the Catholic social tradition, that we believe that we are close to God because of God's creative act, and we are creatures. And paradoxically, being a creature does not take away dignity, it gives us our dignity. There's a beautiful essay by Rowan Williams on being creatures. What does it mean to be a creature? Secondly, in the Catholic social tradition, human dignity has a horizontal dimension of respecting each other's dignity, leads to a sense of solidarity and equality. And dignity-based management will just make sure that we understand there may be hierarchies, but fundamentally there is equality. Thirdly, in the Catholic social tradition, human dignity has an expressive dimension that you need to live up to your human dignity. And that means to live a life where you take your life seriously, to live a life where you contribute to the common good. So human dignity in the Catholic social tradition is a normative concept that expects us to do something. It's not just a privilege, it's also a responsibility. And fourthly, vertically, horizontal, expressive, you have a legal dimension of human dignity in the Catholic social tradition that is also translated into structures. Human dignity is translated into structures. And the most important criterion that I would like to emphasize here is structurally, we want to avoid humiliation. Humiliation. That's such an important insight that it will come again here and here. Humiliation. If you manage a structure, if you are in a leadership responsibility, please avoid entry points for humiliation or humiliating people. If people are humiliated, they are able to do a lot of damage. Can you please think about entry points for humiliation in your institutions? And while you do that, I give you an example from an Austrian hospital. We once asked patients in an Austrian hospital, where do you see entry points for humiliation in your hospital experience? And they gave us 3 examples and 3 points. Number 1, the lack of privacy. So they had these rooms with 4 or 6 beds, 1 shared bathroom. And whenever you have a visitor, everybody is listening in and overhearing what's being said at the bedside. Also, the bathroom, they said, it's not soundproof. It's humiliating, to relieve yourself and feel that, the others in the room are just... Yeah. Secondly, bodily shame. And they said an entry point of humiliation in the hospital context is undressing. How far, for how long, in front of whom, and where do I have to undress? And sometimes the hospital context is a little disrespectful. You have a loose curtain separating the hallway from the little treatment cubicle, and people are stark naked, and then a person walks by and the curtain is flowing, things like that. So that's the second bodily shame. And the third is objectification. And they mentioned the doctor's rounds. The doctor's rounds when they go from bed to bed. And maybe you have a problem here, and they stare at your wound, at your leg, and forget that there may be more to the person than just this wound. And sometimes doctor's rounds means 11, 13 people staring at your wound, and it could be even a less prestigious place than this one, right? Where you have your wound. And these are entry points for humiliation. And in an institutional ethics, this is a very, very important point. Avoid entry points for humiliation. And if you identify entry points for humiliation, make sure that you address them. And there's also a subjective element. Now, coming back to my question, in your institutions, where do you see entry points for humiliation? Anyone who has not yet said a lot? You have a break in 7 minutes. Monica has the mic. Father Andre, the mic is coming around. The mic is coming around, Father Andre.
Yeah, like I am thinking about that when. Okay. When the humiliation begin, and when like is the finish of mentioning or speaking about the errors of your workers or something, like where we have the end, like the normal talk about the error or some mistake, and the humiliation begins. Because like even with small talk about some problems could be a humiliation for someone.
That's true. There's a subjective element in the concept and experience of humiliation, and it's part of the responsibility of the leadership person or the manager to understand the sensitivity level. And then, if a person makes a mistake and you have reasons to believe that this was a mistake, I mean, number one, you have to be really sure this was a mistake. And if it's clear that this was a mistake, I would always recommend talk one-on-one with the person and not in front of the team. There are different team cultures. And we had in the Christian tradition, a monastic tradition where we, as you know, the public confession kind of thing. I would not do that. Because the role of humiliation, intentional humiliation, the Christian tradition, is not something that I would recommend in the 21st century. Even though the reasons back then were, valid reasons. But I would not recommend it. So if you have reasons to say this was a mistake, have a one-on-one conversation, because otherwise it is humiliating for the person who is already weak and is privileged if she is being criticized in public. Thank you. Any other example, entry point for humiliation in your institution? 5 minutes to go. Martina, no. Olya, no. Ivana, no. You can't think of something?
Well, I believe that any Catholic university has the same problem, and it's what Pope says every time, the clericalization. I believe that's the point of humiliation of lay people and sisters and everyone else at the faculty. So they feel somehow, like women feel threatened by the male, how would we say, sect or something like that, class of priests. So something like that could be a point of humiliation, just without intention.
Yeah.
Unintentionally. So
that's a very good point, and it would be lovely to have more space to think about that. Because then the next question is, how do we address this point of humiliation? And you would not respond by saying, well, we don't need priests any longer. This would be an inappropriate response, obviously. But it brings me to the point of privileges. And for example, here in Notre Dame, there is a lot of talk about invisible male white privileges. Male white privileges. And you don't even recognize them or see them yourselves. So I'm, as you know, not a native speaker. And there's a lot of privilege that comes with being a native speaker. I mean, if you're a native speaker and you teach in English, I mean, it's such a privilege. You will never have to worry about pronunciation. Is that the right word? It's a privilege. Similarly with, if you have a certain status, you don't feel out of place in any university setting. And I remember asking students in Notre Dame, entry points of humiliation, and a number of students said the privileged students take up the privileged spaces in a natural way. So they don't ask, can I sit there? They will just sit there. They will not ask, do I have to be quiet in the library? They will just talk. Because, you know, if you're upper class, white and male, there's a certain sense of dear world, be grateful that I'm here, kind of sense. And they're not mean people. And similarly, I mean, of course, we can talk about clericalism as well. But this sense of there are certain people with privileges. Some privileges are explicit. I mean, if it's the clerical color and it comes with certain privileges in certain contexts, the same outfit could be a disadvantage in other contexts, obviously. But that's something that's being discussed. And especially if privileges are not properly managed, it is humiliating. And I could send you a link to an article in Notre Dame. A big hierarchy divide is the distinction between staff and faculty. Staff are brilliant people like Monica and Grant, and faculty are people who teach. And there is a big divide in terms of the merit increases they can get, the privileges in terms of status they have, etc., etc. And there is an article by a very well-qualified staff colleague who is angry and thinks, for good reasons, that this distinction is humiliating, and uses the term humiliation because it's managing privileges. And whether it be clericalism or some other privilege, it's managing privileges where those who are disprivileged are easily humiliated. For example, in the titles at the door, it would be so easy just to give the name. But no, you have to say associate professor, assistant professor, full professor, something like that. No, but you know, and this may be an intentional way of just rubbing it in. If you are a non-tenured teaching professor, for instance, and it's on your door, it's on your letterhead, you know, it's these kinds of things. Yes, you get a break in 2 minutes. But that's really, from a Catholic perspective, human dignity means there are these 4 dimensions, and the most convincing way to operationalize human dignity in practice is non-humiliation. Non-humiliation. And there is this psychological dynamics that those who are in a privileged position in an asymmetrical relationship think that they respect the other person down there much earlier than the other person feeling that she's being respected. So what I'm trying to say is that teachers think that they respect the students much earlier than the students feel respected by the teachers. And similarly, in any hierarchy where you have, you know, different strata, social strata, that those who are less privileged and lower here on the social ladder, it takes longer for them to feel respect, and you have to walk the extra mile. Because it's easy to get used to privileges, and then you forget how it was like to be, you know, an insecure first semester student, not knowing what to say, and then being asked by, you know, Martina, what do you say? Cold calling. Some students say cold calling is humiliating. And it depends on the culture, of course. Lisa loves cold calling. But it depends on the culture and on the student and the person as well, but being sensitive to that. It's 3 o'clock. Should we say a break of 7 full minutes? 10 minutes? 7 is good. Yes, starting now. Starting now. We can discuss for 3 minutes, but we should have it for 10 minutes. 7 minutes starting now. Any comments or footnotes? So, where are we speaking from? Humility, understanding what management cannot do, and a position of discipleship, managing structures and people as a way of following Jesus the Christ. A definition of management, coordination of processes and practices to achieve specific and explicit goals. Then we had those 4 observations. A positive and a negative example, Mid-Staffordshire Hospital scandal and the Benedictines. And then we made a few remarks about human dignity. With the main message, humiliation is the most tangible form of disrespecting a person's dignity and should be avoided in structures and systems and in the context that you're responsible for. And it happens quite easily. As I said, even cold calling can be seen as humiliating.
Be personal, has that happened to you?
Hu-
Any kind of humiliation here in the US? Anything?
Oh, you know, it happens to me. I think it depends how generous I am with the term humiliation. But I had to undergo, and Lisa had to undergo it as well, the process of getting a green card. And it's a humiliating process. So they give you the message, we don't want you in this country, and we don't want to spend any taxpayers' money on you. So there is a new form that was introduced by the Trump government. Did you have to fill in the form of self-sufficiency? It's 29 pages, and you have to show, it's called the form of self-sufficiency, that you don't need US taxpayers' money, because I grab Austrian taxpayers' money. No, and so we have a house in Austria, we had to assess the house, we had to show our medical status, we had to go through a health examination. It's like you buy a cow in the market and you want to make sure, is the cow healthy enough, or would I have to? So that's a personal experience, which I just...
I thought with J1 visa.
Yeah, yeah,
Like all the background check, it was just incredible.
exactly, right.
Family, my parents, my lady, my parents.
It's not just it works the other way, just FYI, it works the other way.
Yeah,
I
the
had
same?
this in
Yeah.
Britain, so,
Oh, okay.
not just America.
Yeah.
No, and I'm sure that the Austrian government does that to foreigners as well. And here there is this asymmetry between individual and the institution, which is another management thing. If you represent a powerful institution, you can humiliate individuals so easily because just of this, yeah. And in Austria, we read Franz Kafka a lot. I see you, Lisa. And Franz Kafka talks a lot about the powerlessness of the individual exposed to the arbitrariness of the institution. And what made me really nervous in the green card process was that there are no deadlines. It can take years. And there is no clear deadline. And you are basically at the mercy of the institution. And if they have not enough people to look at the files, it literally takes years. Anyway, so that's my personal story. Lisa.
So since we talked about humility being subjective,
Humiliation.
sorry, how do you navigate kind of being mindful of that when something that might be humiliating to the other person may not necessarily be something that you perceive to be humiliating? Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
how do you kind of create that mindfulness, considering the fact that that's a very subjective experience?
Yeah, I like the definition of humiliation by Avishai Margalit, which is a person is humiliated if she has reasons to be violated in her self-respect. Self-respect is the kind of respect that I owe to myself on the basis of being human. So humiliation means I have reasons to feel violated in my self-respect. So I'm not taking as a full human person, as a full member of the human family. And he talks about reasons. I have reasons to feel violated in my self-respect, which is more than a psychiatric idiosyncrasy, because some people may already feel humiliated if you look at them. They will say, well, talk to your counselor, but this is not my problem. And also in an institution, I would say there is only so much you can expect the institution to take care of. If a person has major personal problems, I would say, look, we treat you with respect, but we cannot create that much space for you because we have to, it's like if a student, if a student's English is not strong, there's only so much I can do. And I'm willing to walk a little bit in the extra mile, but I cannot do more than that. And that's where I would see the line between excessive privileges, excessive demands for privileges, and legitimate humiliation. And of course, there are these very dangerous border cases. When I was at King's College London, we had a student who was diagnosed on the autism spectrum with Asperger's disease. And I never taught the student, I just know my colleagues who taught him said his father was a lawyer, and his father came basically every week demanding this and this and this and this for his son. So extra tutorials, reading material in advance, I don't know what else, and a follow-up session after each lecture. And a colleague said, we can't do that. And then you have three options. Option one, you have additional personnel. Option two, you change the goals of the course. And the course is not, well, we walk through, I don't know, Immanuel Kant or Thomas Aquinas, but we maybe just one little chapter of the Summa. Or third, you kick the student out. These are the three options that were left. And sometimes you have those really tough cases. But there is a point where you say, I cannot accommodate that. I'm very sorry. And I mean, Lisa is a friendly, polite person. But sometimes even you may feel the urge to ask a question like, what went wrong in your childhood? Meaning that's too big for me to solve, and that was not created by the institution. What went wrong in your childhood? And it may be humiliating for the person, even though this is perfectly normal behavior. And there is, I like Regina Rawlinson's book because she opened my eyes to students from socioeconomically deprived backgrounds will take things much quicker personally, And innocent questions like, how was your summer? Or what will you do over spring break? Maybe a humiliating question, and I try to avoid that. Because, and for me, that's a legitimate way of seeing it as humiliating. What will you do? What are your spring break plans? And then the rich students go to Cancun, and we have not many, but at least a handful homeless students here on campus, and they have no place to go. And when you ask them, where will you go for spring break? I mean, it's humiliating. So that would be my response to your question. But it's this sensitivity, and coming back to humor is powerful, but also a major tool of humiliating another person. And what you find, I'm from Austria, I think most of the things are hilarious, I think it's great, it's so funny. But for many people, things are not as funny as I think they are. And yes, and you have to be careful. Jokes. At whose expense, the jokes? And what helps is, you're from Germany, and I'm from Austria, and I'm in a much better position because Austria is such an insignificant country. Who cares about Austria? But Germany is much more powerful, and so when I try to be funny, people say, well, he's from Austria. No, but it's a good question. No, it is a good question. And sometimes you don't read people well. And sometimes you make a stupid remark, and you don't know how the student will receive it. Even examples that you use. And some childhood trauma may come up. Or if students have experienced domestic violence, and you make some flippant remark, I mean, that could be humiliating. And I always tell the students, please, if you have any issue, come to me. One-on-one, we can always talk about all kinds of things, so that there needs to be this open space. And then there has to be this realistic idea of, I'm very sorry, I cannot help with that. Or we have to read that, and there is no other translation. But again, the art of possibility. I think ultimately management has a lot to do with opening spaces where people feel comfortable. It's a little bit like John Hattie. Do you know John Hattie? He's an education researcher from New Zealand. I even didn't know there was education in New Zealand. No, that's not funny. John Hattie, that's not funny. This is what I mean. This is not funny. It was funny. Yeah. The former colony. Right? Okay. John Hattie. He made a meta-study of what's the most important variable in a teaching context. Meta-study means he looked at many studies and found out the most important variable in a teaching context is the person of the teacher. The person of the teacher, and not the classroom size, the architecture, the design, the curriculum. It's the person of the teacher. And the teacher, the good teacher, has 4 properties. Number 1, creates an anxiety-free atmosphere. And I think that's so important, that people feel comfortable speaking up. Feel comfortable speaking up. Anxiety-free, number 1. Number 2, this teacher respects the students. And respect means listens to the students, is attentive to the individual student, tries to read in between the lines, respects. Number 3, gives varied and specific feedback. So varied means not only the same standard clauses, and specific. And specific means if you have an essay from a student and you are encouraged to give specific feedback, you really have to read the essay, which is a sign of respect. And then you give specific feedback and say, the opening paragraph was much better than the conclusion. The conclusion was only a summary, but not the conclusion. And here I didn't understand the transition, specific. And number 4, deep communication of the subject. So a good teacher has the quality of communicating a subject in a deep way. And deep means whatever he or she presents is the tip of the iceberg. He or she has always more to say. I once taught a seminar in Salzburg at the science faculty for biologists. It was like philosophy for biologists. It was a very short course. And 2 students gave a little talk on Aristotle. And it was a 15-minute talk. And in those 15 minutes, they said everything they knew about Aristotle, from the Wikipedia entry or whatever they consulted. 15 minutes. And when there were the questions afterwards, they would just repeat things they had said before. So that's not tip of the iceberg thing. That's all I know about. Yeah. And you can transfer that to a management context and would say anxiety-free, respect, feedback, variety and specific, and always have more tools in your toolbox, so to speak. Similarly, in a ministerial context, if you're a priest and people come to you, I mean, you should always be able to say more. I mean, don't say more all the time, but you could say more or different things. And same, I mean, if you listen to confession, obviously, you will not simply repeat standard clauses. That's how I would say that. Good. Okay. Yes, please.
So you can approach the content of dignity, human dignity, from different moral attitudes or moral values. And how can you handle the conflicts between different moral approach of human dignity? For instance, you mentioned the connection between teacher and students. And if students believe based on a totally different belief and a totally different system or moral system, then how can you respect his special expectations about dignity?
Yeah. What I would suggest here is that we take the Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1. And it's very difficult to say in public, I don't care. That's why it was called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, December 10, 1948. And whether you are from Poland or from Nigeria or from Austria, from the US, I mean, this is a relevant document for you. And Article 1 says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, full stop. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should treat each other with a spirit of fraternity. And if I take that, I will say this is enough. This is enough as a starting point to think about human dignity. And if we only take those two lines from the Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, we see a message about equality, fundamental equality, that is so deep that no social system can undo this equality. We see freedom as fundamental, that the burden of proof lies with those who restrict the freedom and not with those who respect the freedom. We see also a lack of justification of dignity. If you remember, one of my first questions was, in the Catholic tradition, the Christian tradition, what is our justification for human dignity? And then Father Pavel said, image and likeness of God. Yes, many people don't believe that, and the Universal Declaration does not have a justification for human dignity, but we can use the term nonetheless. That was an insight by Jacques Maritain. Even if we cannot agree on the justification of human dignity, we can understand when a person's dignity is violated and why it is important. We also see that the declaration that was published in 1948 in the wake of the Second and probably even First World Wars shows the message: without our experience of human vulnerability, we would not have the discourse on human dignity. That was not good English. So we experienced fragility and vulnerability in the first two world wars. The preamble of the Universal Declaration says we have seen the atrocities. What happens if people don't respect other people's dignity? We have seen the atrocities. So vulnerability of the other person is a major basis for human dignity. We don't need to be able to justify human dignity in the last sense. As Christians, we have a justification, but which is, as you said, not shared by others. But we can still understand that vulnerability is a major element in the discourse. All human beings are vulnerable. Everybody is mortal. Everybody can be injured. I mean, we know these things. And then we see the declaration also talks about human beings are endowed with reason and conscience. And for me, that means people have a right to reasons. And I mentioned it briefly in passing, that for me, management has a lot to do with giving reasons. And I don't care whether the person comes from the People's Republic of China, or from Nicaragua, or from Poland. People have a right to reasons. Why is the decision this way and not the other way? Give me reasons. And the person may not be able to accept the reasons, but at least there are reasons. That's how I would deal with this pluralism, that we would say there is a common denominator in this Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then we can look into the differences. Also, it is easier to define violations of human dignity than the ideal of human dignity. And that's where, for me, humiliation is unpleasant for anybody, as something where I would like to deal with this pluralistic argument that you just made. And maybe a last remark, what I also find in Article 1 is a sense of uniqueness. People are endowed with conscience, it says. And conscience is this very personal sense of right and wrong, where we Catholics believe in the objective formation of conscience, that's true, but nonetheless there is this personal element where I believe human dignity is the message we are equal in our uniqueness. Everybody is unique, and that's a beautiful thought, because uniqueness means, and I wanted to talk about that here under challenges, we won't have the time, I guess, that management likes to standardize processes. We like to standardize processes. That's part of making things efficient and fair as well. But if you do that, there's always a risk of disrespecting the uniqueness of a person and her specific needs, which also means manage a system in the way that the individual case can become a special case. We know that in medical ethics. Allow each case to have the potential to become a special and specific case and not just the application of a standard model. That's how I would respond to your point. And some people would still have different interpretations. And I would say, let's walk in small steps. Let's walk in small steps. Could we agree on Article 1 of the Universal Declaration? Could we agree on humiliation as a violation of human dignity? And if we have agreement on that, we have really won a lot of territory, and then I don't worry too much about the justification.
Small question.
Sure.
Is just slightly connected to what you said, but we discussed many things like growing up or raising up from negative concepts like humiliation, or maybe we had World War and then we discussed human dignity. As a philosopher, what do you think? Don't we have so many new definitions because of negative experience of many people? Like Luther, he began his Reformation because of his personal problems with something, and that something new came up. So is it a good way for philosophy, for education, for management, or anything? If we just still follow, it's a very brainstorming, I don't know how to finish the sentence, but if we follow the negative connotation of every situation that people in front of me have, like as you said, it could be humiliating. As a professor, I cannot pay attention to any particular need of my students. I don't know, it's impossible somehow. So that's my question, like positive view of professor, negative.
Can I try to answer your question by moving to this point? So done, right? And then we move to this point here, because I would like here to approach moral goods in a positive way, and then make a step back and go to the negative way again. And then you can look at me in a disappointed way and say, oh, not again. No. So managing moral goods. If you accept human dignity, there are two implications, at least. One is respect, and the other is self-respect. If you accept all human beings have human dignity, if you accept that, there are two implications. One is respect, because then I have to say Lisa has human dignity, Father Pavel has human dignity, Martina has human dignity, and then I owe respect to you because of your human dignity. That's an implication. I cannot say I accept your human dignity, but nothing follows for me. You cannot do that. That's not only not nice, it's also philosophically wrong, right? And respect means, in philosophy we sometimes say to respect a person means to accept the person as a source of normative claims. That's not very sexy in the wording, but it just means the fact that Martina is here limits my space of agency and structures my agency. So I cannot act in a way as if Martina was not here, because that's humiliating. And one way to humiliate the person is to ignore the person. And one way to humiliate the person is if a person wants to say something, to ignore the person. And that's a way of disrespecting a person, acting as if she was not there. So that's the minimum of respect, source of normative claims. The second implication of human dignity is self-respect. Because if every human being has human dignity, I'm a human being, then I have human dignity, which means I owe some respect to myself on the basis of having dignity, which was my definition for Lisa, humiliation, feeling violated or having reasons to feel violated in one's self-respect. So respect and self-respect together bring me to a moral key term, positive key term. And the key term is integrity. Integrity. I like this term a lot because it's not ideologically laden as laden and loaded as many others, and it combines respect and self-respect. And in philosophy, we sometimes say integrity means, on the one hand, sincerity, that you take life seriously, that you know it makes a difference how I live my life. It's not bloody indifferent. I take it seriously. There are deep questions. There are serious challenges, and I can do something with my life. Sincerity, which is also part of honesty. So you make an honest attempt to live a decent life. And honest attempt, as I said before, we can make efforts, but we may be unsuccessful, but at least we can say we tried. And the other is integration. Integrity means you are not a split-level personality, where you say one thing and do another thing, or where you are a completely different person in the family context or in the professional context. You try to integrate what you do and who you are, integrity. And there's if you have time or interest, there is this wonderful Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, free of charge, online available. And there's an entry on integrity, which I can highly recommend. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's not Notre Dame Encyclopedia of Philosophy, unfortunately. It's Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And they're great articles, really very, very high level, and there's one on integrity. And it talks about these dimensions. Okay, so if I accept that as a key moral value that's connected to human dignity, it means managing an institution in a human dignity fashion allows people to live their professional lives with integrity. Do not push people in situations of moral distress. Moral distress means you are under pressure to perform against your professional moral standards. That happened in a mid-Staffordshire hospital. Nurses and doctors were forced to treat patients in a way they would not choose to treat the patients, but the structure basically pushed them in this situation. So they could not live lives of integrity. And if you manage or lead an institution, be aware of the integrity needs of the people you work with. And don't ask a person to lie for you. Don't ask a person to spend only 6 minutes with a student or a patient, things like that. And sometimes we create structures. In the National Health Service, the average time of the first consultation of a patient with a doctor is 6.5 minutes. Because the doctor has to see so many patients during the day, they're targets, they're monitored. And there's also statistics that the patient tries to describe his or her symptoms, and after 23 seconds, the doctor, average, interrupts the patient and tells the patient what's wrong. Because of, and that's, you violate integrity. And there's another term, I don't know whether this is helpful or not, epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice is a term that means you underestimate a person's contribution to knowledge or insight. And we often do that with patients. We also do that with students. We underestimate their contribution to knowledge and insight by not taking them seriously. So managing a structure for me has a lot to do with allowing people to live lives of integrity, where you have the space and the time and the agency to make decisions. And obviously, since we talked about J1 visa or green card, there are so many officers in this process who don't have agency. They can just follow these little orders. And they may say, but it's not right. And you don't, if you can change it. You do not want to have colleagues in situations where they are forced to do things that they are not comfortable doing, and they have good reasons for not being comfortable. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So integrity enhancing practices. So dignity-based management means the coordination of integrity respecting processes and integrity enhancing practices to achieve specific and explicit dignity compatible goals. That would be then a positive definition of that. And I would then offer, these are my primary moral goods. My primary moral goods are respect, self-respect, and integrity, primary. Then we can talk about secondary moral goods. And here I will offer 2 insights. So far, so good?
What if humiliation of someone, felt personally, I feel humiliated somehow, but it's better for my integrity as final goal.
That was I trying to say. Like my
personal experience of something doesn't have to be a goal for the class or for my human dignity because I just said it. I don't feel uncomfortable or whatever. So I'm starting from my personal experience. That's what Luther did. He said something didn't was nice to him in religion, Catholic religion, and so he set another goal. Again, we are with the question of goal. So if there is a question of self-humiliation which helps me to improve my self-integrity, without me acknowledging it, if it's not the goal of education or...
I'm not sure that I follow you completely. I mean, I could think of, I just finished the autobiography of Miroslav Marinovic, whom you all know, who was a dissident and was humiliated, I mean, over a period of at least 10 years. And yes, it helped his spiritual growth. And it helped his authority, and he's an impressive person. And on the personal level, and that's why in the Christian tradition we have this intentional humiliation for people to grow spiritually. Yeah, but I'm not prepared in a leadership position to support any humiliating procedures, even if they may be good for the spiritual growth of an individual person, because that's not where I see my authority. If you decide to found a religious order, and this is part of your spirituality, well, I will not interfere with that. But if I run like the Nanovic Institute, I may have the private opinion it could be good for person A and his or her spiritual growth to be humiliated. And of course, if I experience humiliation, that's how we dealt with the green card process. In a spiritual way of saying, well, God, this is part of our experience now, and we try to accept this as humbling in the good way of bringing us closer to Christ. Personal. But you cannot manage a system on this basis. I think we are on the same page with that. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that a lot because it sounds like a good way from the Catholic view. We had a big experience. I don't know if you learned that it was a big case in Slovakia, and I'm still thinking about it. Bishop Bezak was, his office of bishop was revocated. It was a stir in Slovak church, the biggest in the history of 1,000 year of church in Slovakia, because we didn't know why. All the bishops followed Pope Benedict's decision. Then what happened, etc., etc. And Robert Bezak, the bishop, ex-bishop, he went to the media, public media, no Christian media, and he was complaining all the time. And people said, his case could be a very good example for Christians how to accept the cross, humiliation, public humiliation, but in order to achieve a goal of better good, common good for any Catholic in Slovakia to see this is the example how to carry a cross. He didn't do that. So it was one of the ways, yeah. There was a humiliation, public humiliation of him from the side of the church. However, he showed precisely not Christian way how to accept it.
Yeah.
So it could be a wonderful example of Christian way how to accept the cross.
Yeah.
But didn't do that. So now it's part of Slovak history, precisely the question of integrity and humiliation.
No, that's fascinating because also there is a moment of self-respect and not accepting a man-made cross, so to speak, and saying I resist that. Also, Miroslav Marinovic in the autobiography, I mean, he was in situations where he could have silently accepted the humiliation, but he spoke out and accepted further sanctions against him and further negative implications. So that's something to keep in mind as we continue with our thought journey. So I would like to offer, on a dignity-based management approach, so-called secondary moral goods. Do you remember John Rawls? Yes. No. Judy? You could also say, you could say, the John Rawls? The John Rawls? Yes. John Rawls? No, I mean the American philosopher who died in 2002, who wrote this book, A Theory of Justice, in 1971. So that's whom I mean, John Rawls. That's whom you mean as well.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you're going to support him or he wasn't
Yeah, the point is not whether I support him or not. The point is to draw secondary moral goods from his veil of ignorance thought experiment. Very simple. So John Rawls, he started in 1958, by the way, with his essay Justice as Fairness, which Judy didn't like too much when she read it. And he started his book in 1971 with a so-called thought experiment of the veil of ignorance. I hope that you all understand the term veil of ignorance. Veil of ignorance. Veil is, yeah. Well, it's you know, Muslim women would have a veil. Veil of ignorance. And the thought experiment is really clever. And even Judy liked it. Oh yes, you did. If all the members of a society came together to discuss the principles on which to build a society, and they came together under a veil of ignorance, what would they agree on? So the idea is we come together as a group here in this room to think about what would be the important building principles for our society, and we don't know anything about our status, about our family, about our origin, about our status, about our capability set, veil of ignorance. We just know, and that's John Rawls, which Julie and I don't like too much, we are utility maximizing beings. Anyway, so we don't know anything. And it's a very clever question. It's a very clever question. And you can ask the very same question for an institution. If all the stakeholders of an institution came together under a veil of ignorance, not knowing whether you will be the president of Notre Dame or part of the cleaning staff or part of a dean or a professor or an administrator somewhere, if you don't know all that, you don't know anything, what would be the guiding principles? And John Rawls has two, and I add a third one. The first is freedom, a maximum amount of freedom for each person, each level. Because if I don't know where I will come to land, I would support freedom for everybody, a maximum of freedom. Obviously, that doesn't mean it's limitless, but a maximum of freedom. And maximum of freedom means, and that's very good for managing systems, if you have the choice to give people more freedoms rather than fewer freedoms, choose the first and not the second. Freedom. And there are, I could make a footnote. Could I make a footnote at 344? Do you know Michael Marmot's famous Whitehall studies? Michael Marmot. That's a footnote. So keep the thought on Rawls, right? Thought, Rawls. Footnote, Michael Marmot. Sir Michael Marmot, Whitehall studies. What he did in 1978 first cohort and 2005 second cohort, he looked at English public officials and their health. He's the guy who created the social determinants of health literature. And he found out, and that's my point here, that if you have, let's say, 14 different classes of public employees in England, the health correlates with the class. So if if class 1 is the highest class 1 is healthier than class 2, class 6 is healthier than class 7, which is so sad. Because I would like to think of rich people as at least having health problems, right? But it seems that it's not the case. And he said that the most important variable here is decision latitude. It is health promoting if you can decide when to do which kind of job, or if you can even pick your portfolio. That's health promoting. And so that's just a footnote here, freedom. If you have the freedom to decide when you want to do what, it's good for your health. And if you can maximize those choices for the people who work with you, that's good for the overall performance, of course, but it's good for the health of the person. And if you have those choices to maximize freedoms, do that. So that's John Rawls' number 1, freedom, as the first principle that we would agree on under veil of ignorance. The second one is difference. Obviously, people are different and there are inequalities. And then people have different capability levels and different health situations. So the differences should be used in a way that it helps the most disprivileged. It's a little more complicated in John Rawls, but basically the idea is make sure that inequalities are used in a way that helps the most disprivileged. So which means in our case, we have a Holy Cross priest as our president. And of course, the president is in the hierarchy on top of the university ladder. But make sure that this helps to pursue the common good and helps to support the disprivileged members of our university community. Which means It's a little bit like the abbot in the Benedictine rule. The abbot in the rule of Benedict has to look out for the weakest members of the community. Special consideration of the weakest members, like the abbot. Okay? So these are the two principles that John Rawls will get out of the veil of ignorance. And I would like to add a third for institutions. And the third for institutions is mission. Mission. Because if I don't know where I will come to land in an institutional hierarchy, I would still want the institution to be able to fulfill or at least pursue its mission. And you saw with the Mid-Staffordshire hospital scandal, the hospital was not able to fulfill its mission. And that's, by the way, a very important question to ask in management. We talked about goals. What is the point of an institution? What is the mission of an institution? Sorry? To limit the freedom. Yeah, it depends, right? So you have these debates about what is the mission of a prison. Is it the mission of a prison to rehabilitate prisoners back into society? Is it to give them a sense of punishment? Is it to protect society from certain people? And you can say all three, yes, but in which order? And it depends a lot how you define the mission of a prison, the way you manage, even design the prison architecturally, whatever, you know what I mean. So mission. So I would say, if you use John Rawls' veil of ignorance, you can apply it to institutions, to little departments, to little institutes, to whole universities, to parishes and dioceses. If we came together on the veil of ignorance, what would we want to see as guiding principles? Freedom, differences that are fruitful for inequalities, and mission. The first two are Rawls, the third is mine. Good? I mean, good in the sense of, does that make sense? The second approach for secondary moral goods to be managed, and this is all positive, right, Father Pavel? Integrity is positive, freedom, fruitful difference plus mission. The other approach is this. It's the opposite of John Rawls in a sense. I mentioned that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was based or is based on the experience of vulnerability and atrocities. And I believe that without our experience of vulnerabilities, there would not be a discourse on human dignity. It would not be necessary. Because human dignity is fragile and people can be easily violated in their dignity, we need the discourse and the legal protection. So we know something about real evil and real darkness. The first book, I am tempted to ask, do you know the title of the first book by Rowan Williams? Forget it. So Rowan Williams' first book is The Wound of Knowledge. It's a beautiful title, The Wound of Knowledge. And he talked about actually Christian mystics, the wound of knowledge. Some knowledge is painful to have. And many of us in our biographies found things out about, I don't know, our family situations, which afterwards it was more difficult to live with than to live without. Wound of knowledge. And so if we have, and that's the second approach, the wound of knowledge that we are fallible human beings who do damage to other human beings, if we know that, what would be more principles that come from that? And here again, I would suggest three. One is common good. I write here freedom, difference, and mission, just that we don't forget that. That's the Rawls thing. And common good. If I know that I am vulnerable, I know that I depend on others, I know that I rely on others, then I will very much want to support the common good. And if you manage an institution, the best reasons are those that appeal to the common good and not to your own personal advantage. One of my best friends, 9 minutes to go, one of my best friends was the president of the University of Salzburg in Austria, and he had to deal with, as many university presidents, crazy academics. Do you know that? I mean, academics who just lost touch with reality. And he had this one colleague who was a professor, full professor of mathematics, and he had two offices. One for his whatever mathematicians do, I have no idea. I don't know why they need an office anyway, but it seems that they... Yes, and the second office he needed for his motorbike collection. So he had 18 motorbikes. It was a big office. And there was space scarcity at the university, and the president had to tell him, you will have to give up one of your two offices. And he almost started to cry because his wife didn't want the motorbikes in the living room. And I mean, beautiful motorbikes, it seems. And then the president said, and that's a priceless line, "Give me reasons so that I can justify that in public." That's a very good line. If crazy people come to you with crazy demands, that's a standard reply I would like to give. Give me reasons, meaning I'm on your side. I mean it well. I love your motorbikes. I love your second office. It's great. But give me reasons that I can justify that in public, meaning that the common good aspect is understandable. What is the connection between this and the common good? And the common good is the flourishing of the entire system, the whole unit, the whole community. And it's not enough that you have a better life or that your wife has a better life. That's not enough. Common good. Which is, by the way, an interesting challenge we face here at the Nanovic Institute. This is the Keough School of Global Affairs, as you have noticed. And we are in the Nanovic Jenkins Hall. And we are part of a school of global affairs together with other institutes. And now, Catholic social teaching tradition, literature doesn't talk too much about that. There are competing common goods. The common good of the Nanovic Institute is not always the same as the common good of the Keough School, which is not always the same as the common good of Notre Dame, which is not always the same as the common good of South Bend or the common good of the Catholic Church. Yes, so complicated. But this would be my first. If I know that I depend on others, I would really want to invest in the common good. So what's good for the unit that is part of a larger picture, where this question of the ultimate goal is so important, where discipleship is such an important category to have in a Catholic university. They would say, yes, sure, it's great if Notre Dame grows its endowment, but this is not the ultimate goal of the university. It's a means to an end. And means to an end means it's not the end goal, which means it's a little bit like the idea of health as the highest good or safety as the highest good. We have heard that a lot last year in Notre Dame. Safety of the employees is our highest good, and say this is not true. It's just not true that safety is our highest priority. If that's the case, then stay home. It's safe at home. And the same with health. It is true that health is an important good. It's not the highest good. I don't live in order to be healthy. I try to be healthy in order to live. Again, means to an end. So that's the first secondary moral good I would draw from this wound of knowledge, knowing that I'm vulnerable and also that I'm making mistakes. I wound other people. I'm vulnerable, I'm wounded, and I wound other people. So if I have this wound of knowledge, common good is one implication. The second one is recognition. Recognition. There is one German philosopher who worked for many years on this term. This is Axel Honneth. Axel Honneth. And he talked about social recognition in three forms: material, symbolic, and social. And I think one of the questions that you submitted, and Monica shared it with us, presenters, was the question, how do you make people feel appreciated? And that's a question of social recognition. So if I know that I depend on other beings and am a social being, I want to be recognized. And material recognition, of course, means money. Sometimes we cannot give more money. Then you can show social recognition, at least by recognizing a person as a person. Eye contact, remembering the name. You know, it's always impolite not to be able to remember the name or pronounce the name. You know, that's always impolite. And then there's symbolic recognition, where you can create an award. You can create the Father Pavel Hero Award, and then you just give a little certificate, which is almost free of charge, but people, yeah. So that's the second. And the third is future. Future. Especially since we know that we are vulnerable, you want to invest in the future of an institution in a way that allows the institution to die. Maybe I'm losing you now here. My thought is this. Prudence means a long-term perspective. Prudence, according to Aquinas, in case I haven't mentioned it before, means a long-term perspective. You don't look at the next 2, 3, or 5 years. You have a long-term perspective. And future also means sustainability, which also means we have to live in a way that future generations have a chance to live as well, including future generations in this university or in my unit. And if I use this thinking 4 minutes to go, I would have a few primary moral goods that we try to manage: integrity, respect, and self-respect, and 6 secondary moral goods: freedom, difference, mission, common good, recognition, and future. And then I can ask the question, and this is where Father Pavel may become critical again, where do things go wrong? And one very helpful term in institutional ethics is the term hell. It's a very useful term because our images of hell tell us a lot about structural arrangements that we would like to avoid. I'm always tempted to say at all costs. Creating hell on earth. If you read literature on concentration camps, you will often find words like they created hell on earth. And then you can ask the question, well, what did they do? And one major instrument to create hell on earth is arbitrariness or impossible rules. Arbitrariness means, I talked about toxic stress. People don't know what will happen next. And impossible rules means you create rules that people cannot possibly follow. And which means, positively, human dignity-based management means you will try to make sure that people know what to expect: reliability, calculability, predictability. So we have a rhythm. We have those rules. You know what will be expected from you tomorrow. There is no arbitrariness. Because this is really, really bad if people are punished for something which was not punishable 2 days ago, for example. So arbitrariness, to be countered by regularity, rule-based, and obviously impossible rules. You make rules that can be followed. And this is not a given. I mean, if you remember the Mid-Staffordshire Hospital scandal with the 2 cultures, and my example from King's College London with the essay tutorials, I mean, this is not a given that people have rules that they can really realistically follow. And when we say we expect people to work, let's say, for 40 hours a week, I cannot expect people to really work 8 hours nonstop or even 4 hours nonstop, and then this is not how it works. I mean, people need breaks. People need breaks. And this should be part of the 8 hours, things like that. So there's a lot to be said about hell. In the Apophthegmata Patrum, I will end with that for this section. Apophthegmata Patrum is a collection of the wisdom of desert fathers and a few desert mothers from the early 5th centuries. And there are 2 visions of hell in this collection. One is the vision of hell of Macarius. He had a vision of hell where people are bound back to back without any eye contact. And that's deep. Hell is a place where there is no eye contact, where you cannot see another person's eyes, where you have no name, no face. If you know Emmanuel Levinas, the famous philosopher, he talked about a lot about le visage, the face of the person. So hell is a place without eye contact, which means dignity-based management means you know people by name, you know their stories and their faces, and you make an effort to get to know their stories and their faces. And the other vision of hell in the Apophthegmata Patrum is hell is the place where you wait for something, but you don't know what you are waiting for because hell is eternal. And that's part of this absurdity. It's a little bit en attendant Godot, if you remember the famous absurd theater. You wait, but it's pointless. And that is why I emphasize, and I continue to emphasize, giving people reasons. Giving people reasons. Telling people we do this because I want this to happen this way is not enough. Give me reasons. Ignatius of Loyola is one of these amazing persons who ran the Society of Jesus on this reason-based leadership model. He once asked all the provincials to send a weekly report to Rome. Weekly report to Rome to keep the headquarters informed. And one of the provincials wrote back and said, I don't have time for this. He didn't say bullshit, but something like that. I didn't have time for this. It's a waste of my time. And Ignatius sat down and gave him 26 reasons why he thought it was very important to have a weekly report. And it's a lot of time for one stupid provincial. But the point here is, give me reasons. So that at least people understand, I may not agree with you, but I understand that you have thought about it and you can offer some reasons, or many reasons, and then it's not hell on earth, it's not pointless, it has background. So this is what I want to say about managing moral goods. In a positive way and ex negativo, there's so much more we can say about hell, but it's 4:01. And the question is, what will happen next with our lives? Let me summarize, and then I ask whether you have footnotes or questions or complaints or comments. So we started our session on dignity-based management with the question, where are we speaking from? I tried to advertise this question as an important question. Where are we speaking from? We are speaking from a perspective where we do not expect too much from management. There's only so much management can do, and there is a sense of humility that comes with knowing about the limits of management. The unplanned consequences of implications or effects of a project are sometimes more important than the planned consequences. Secondly, we are speaking from a position of disciples of Christ, where even questions like management and leadership are a way of following Jesus, the Christ, where homework could be identifying gospel passages where we can learn from Jesus about management. We talked about Luke 10, we talked about Mark 10:45, we talked about the washing of the feet, we talked about Matthew 14, and I'm not saying that Jesus was a manager, but Jesus obviously had to manage resources and had to coordinate individuals and had to help achieve certain goals. So there's a lot to be learned here. Then I offered here a definition of management, a very simple one. The advantage of the simple one is it can be applied to many different contexts, be it educational, be it health, be it a government context. Management as the coordination of processes and practices to achieve specific and explicit goals. And then we talked about some of the implications of this definition. Thirdly, we looked at two examples, a positive and a negative one, the positive being the Benedictines and the resilience of monasteries in terms of their economic performance, good governance as the key word, based on recruiting, division of labor, value system, participation, and external control. And I also said, which could be another homework, going through the rule of Benedict and looking at the management structures that we find here is a very fruitful exercise. The negative example was the Mid-Staffordshire Hospital scandal from 2005 through 2009 with 400 to 1,200 excess deaths based on or brought about by pursuing financial targets at the expense of patients' well-being. And it goes back to this question, what's the point of a hospital? If it's not patients' well-being, what is it then? And the interviews with the National Health Service taught us that many people perceive a divide between the managerial culture and those who do the work on the floor, so to speak. And some of our interviewees said things, too many chiefs, not enough Indians. You know, you have these high salaried managers somewhere who have no idea what we do in our everyday lives. If they just came for one day to accompany us and see what we do every day, they would have not only more respect for what we do, but also a deeper sense. So it's still a big issue, by the way, in England, National Health Service. So it's good that the soccer players are healthy enough to beat Italy. Okay, then we made a fourth point, a few remarks about human dignity as the basis. There is obviously a religious reading of human dignity. In the Compendium of the Social Doctrine in 107, we are told that human dignity and the respect for the principle of human dignity is really the anchor and the basis for all principles of Catholic social teaching. Image and likeness of God as our justification in the Christian tradition. Clary mentioned what about pluralism, and I would say if we take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the basis, we can also get some important messages out of the understanding of human dignity, such as the experience of vulnerability, such as the non-foundationality. There is no justification for human dignity in the Declaration, the importance of freedom, the importance of uniqueness, the importance of reasons, and the importance of equality. And then in the last section, we talked about moral goods. So I do institutional ethics. And for me, institutions always also have moral purposes. They have to achieve certain moral goals. They have to manage moral goods. A good, by the way, is something that you prefer to exist rather to not exist. So philosophers sometimes say X is a good if I prefer a situation with X over a situation without X. Schopenhauer said to love a person means to prefer the person to exist rather than non-exist. Yeah. And yes, but in a traffic jam, Judy, have you ever thought about that? I thought, I mean, all these people in front of me, it would be better for me if they were never been born. Yeah. I mean, just for me now, you know, who knows in the long term. But I normally don't say that aloud. But that's a good. So moral goods. I think a very important moral good is integrity, respect and self-respect, managing institutions in a way that people can live with integrity, professional integrity. And that's where I keep talking about these 6 parishes. You know, in my home diocese in Upper Austria, they reduced the number of parishes from 487 to 40. From 487 to 40. And I mean, yeah, how can you be a pastor with integrity if you have now 9 parishes? I mean, they call it differently. Canon is a different story. But you know what I mean. And I use the term moral distress. You push people in situations where they are morally stressed out. And I'm looking, yeah, I will teach a class, an incoming KU student class with 51 students in the fall. And that's a lot when you try to take them seriously. And I just hope that it can be managed, because otherwise it would be a matter here of we talked about it, looking at the individual needs of the person, uniqueness of the person. And if you have a group like this, it's much easier than if you have 51, let alone 100 or 500. So integrity. John Rawls, Julie likes John Rawls' veil of ignorance experiment, but then it goes downhill, she says. If we take that, we can apply it to institutions. If I do not know where I will be in an institution, what would I support as a building principle? Freedom, fruitful difference that has special attention to the weakest members, and mission, being able to pursue its mission. And wound of knowledge was the other approach. If you accept that you are vulnerable, wounded, and that you wound other people, because we make mistakes, also moral mistakes, what would be consequences of that? And I suggest common good. If I know that I need others and I rely on others, I will invest in the common good, the flourishing of the whole community. I will be very interested in social recognition. There are these studies, happiness at work studies. In England, there is an NGO, and they do an annual surveys on happiness at work, where they ask about 1,200 individuals who work in companies with more than 100 employees. And over the last 10 years, the number 3 reasons why people are happy and the number 3 reasons why people are unhappy at work are pretty stable. And the 3 reasons why people are unhappy at work are poor communication, poor recognition, poor boss. And not salary. Salary is a reason, but it's not the top 3 reasons of why I'm unhappy at work. Poor communication, I don't know what's happening. And you know, many companies, also universities. My first university, where I had a professorship in Salzburg, has now a new leadership, and they don't talk to people. There are rumors. People say, well, we will create 2 new faculties. Instead of 4, there will be 6. Rumors. Nobody knows exactly what's happening, and people get frustrated with that. So talk to people. Communication. People are very unhappy if they don't know what's going on. Communication. And our provost, I have to say, makes an effort to keep the university campus involved with regular messages to the entire campus community. That's helpful. So communication. Poor recognition is this point here. People feel underappreciated. So I work hard, and then people don't see my contribution, which I mentioned here under the topic epistemic injustice, if you remember. So make an effort to recognize people. And Grant is very, very good at that. Handwritten notes, reaching out to colleagues and letting them know, I know and appreciate that you worked on the Saturday, etc. So recognition. And the third reason is poor boss, which comes back to what Father Pavel and I discussed, having an idiot as your superior. That's a shame. It's a shame. And there are more polite ways to say that, but sometimes, especially in a world that manages privileges not very well, it's sometimes easy for idiots to get into leadership positions. I mean, have you ever thought about that? If you want to create a certain CV, that looks good, who pays the cost? Who pays the expense for the CV? I mean, quite often it's spouses, it's children, it's family. I mean, you know what I mean. So that's another issue here. And the positive 3 points for being happy at work is work-life balance, a variety of work, and the quality of work, meaning being challenged. So that the 3 top reasons why people are happy is work-life balance, which is also interesting if you manage an institution in the long run.
Sorry, I don't like the term work-life balance.
Yes, I quoted from this English company. I mean, who likes English companies anyway? Yes. If you manage an institution, don't believe that it's good for you to squeeze out as much of a person as possible. It's not only immoral, in the long term, it also doesn't help you. It's not good in the long run if people don't have good family lives, however you call it. So that's number 1 reason why people are happy, that there is more to their life than work. We know from resilience studies, just in brackets, a person is resilient if she has, like a chair, different legs to stand on. If you really put all your eggs in the professional basket and you have some professional disappointment, you will be frustrated, and then your life loses meaning. They will say, that's so stupid, right? Similarly, if you want your family to be the source for your happiness, don't put this pressure on your children, especially not during the adolescent years, right? Don't see your children during the adolescent years as the sources of your happiness. Yes, don't. Not good for them, not good for you. The second is that you have a variety in work, meaning different types of work. It's not boring. And also, and that's a management idea, dignity-based management could mean, among other things, you offer a person different challenges and different growth opportunities. And then you would say, well, next time we ask Mel to operate the video camera here. But this idea, variety of work, and that has a lot to do with the freedoms that we talked about, allow people a spectrum. And the third was also demanding work, challenges, that people find challenges in their work, which of course comes with putting them in situations where they can grow and where they enter new territory. And whatever we do, there is a first time. So this is the idea of happiness at work, which has a lot to do with recognition. And then finally here, future, managing in a way that you have sustainability, future generations in mind, and the institution as something that is bigger than you. Pedro Arrupe. Do you remember Pedro Arrupe? Anyone remembers Pedro Arrupe? I don't know what happens with his canonization process, but yeah. He was a saintly man, Pedro Arrupe, the General Superior of the Jesuits from 1965 to 1983. In 1981, he had a stroke, and the last 10 years of his life, he died in 1991, he really was bedridden and needed support. Very, very humble person, very prayerful person. And Pedro Arrupe wrote quite a bit about leadership, and one aspect of leadership for him was to look for suitable successors early on. Basically, make sure that the unit functions without you. It is not good to create a management structure where it will stand and fall with you as a person. And that, of course, has a lot to do with also being willing to delegate, to share responsibility, and not to be the core and center of everything. So there is this humility that comes with that. Before I ask you whether you have any comments, I would like to add 2 more things which I call moral support goods. Moral support goods. One is infrastructure, and the other one is trust. In order to create all these moral goods, you need support goods, and one is infrastructure. Infrastructure, here in Notre Dame, infrastructure, that means infrastructure. Sorry, my handwriting. Sorry about my English. Sorry about this very poor red thing. Sorry about this. And this means trust. Yeah. Do you know, when I take notes, I normally cannot read what I wrote, but I remember what I wrote when I wrote it. No, that's how I can read it. Not because, yeah, I'm sure there's a name for that. I'm sure there's a name for that.
Kinesthetic learning? Is that not?
Maybe.
Learning through doing, learning, and the note taking is the kinesthetic as opposed to the visualization.
Yeah, but it seems to be a defect or disease, I guess. And then work on your handwriting. So infrastructure. Infrastructure. Managing institution means you manage infrastructure. And you cannot expect people to work with crappy infrastructure. I mean, you can expect. And sometimes there is no alternative. But sometimes we talk about saving money. And we can save money at the wrong places. And then, you know, it's money lost. Having a good computer is not a luxury. Having a nice office is not a luxury. And things like that. Whatever you can influence to build the infrastructure, I would recommend doing. Because you cannot expect people to make huge sacrifices, work with crappy infrastructure. The crappier the infrastructure, the higher the motivation has to be. I mean, that's how it is. And maybe, I mean, if we work in university context where the university does not have much money, then the mission consciousness and sensitivity has to be very strong. That's important. Which is, of course, a downside here in Notre Dame, because people will say, well, who cares about the mission of the university as long as I have a nice computer? But this is infrastructure. And in the literature, we distinguish between the tangible infrastructure and the intangible infrastructure. The tangible infrastructure are all these beautiful things here that we can touch and see. The intangible infrastructure are knowledge, ideas, and values. Knowledge, ideas, and values. Knowledge, ideas, and values. And we know, again, from resilience studies, that resilient companies are those who have clear value structures, a clear value structure. What are we here for? And Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, those who know why they live can live with any way of life. This is not a good translation. Meaning, if you have a why to live for, you can endure any how. Yeah, something like this. So the intangible infrastructure should always take the primacy over the tangible one and not the other way around. So if you plan a building, the intangible infrastructure, values, knowledge, and ideas should be the primacy and then follows the architecture and not the other way around. And obviously, there were some things here in the Kio school that I would have done differently. We have those classrooms in the basement. We're not calling it basement. How do we call this? Ground floor. Lower level. Yes. Yes. Yeah, we don't say basement people, we say lower level employees, right? Yeah. Anyway, and similarly, I mean, some of the offices, yeah, different story. I wouldn't build that many windowless offices as they built in this building. And that's where you would say intangible infrastructure, create a space that does not only look beautiful, but works for human beings. You know, I have not mentioned my favorite philosopher. Ping, my favorite philosopher. I'm from Austria. Who is my favorite philosopher? Yeah, of course. That's my Catholic response. No, but to be very honest, no, my favorite philosopher is Ludwig Wittgenstein. I know. Terrible, isn't it terrible? Yes. The British people killed him. He died in Britain in 1951. In Austria, he would have died many years later. But anyway. Why did I mention Ludwig Wittgenstein now? He's an interesting man. So he was a philosopher, then he was a soldier, then he was a gardener, then he was an architect, then he was a primary school teacher, and then he became a philosopher again, and then he died in, did I mention in Britain? Yeah, and when he was an architect, he built a house in Vienna, which housed the Bulgarian embassy for some time, and it is a beautiful rectangular house where people just cannot live or work. It's just not for human consumption. It's beautiful, it's perfect, it's a sterile house. And that's what I mean with, architecturally speaking, amazing, but it's not, you don't want to work there, let alone live there, and it's not inhabitable. And that's where the intangible infrastructure should take the lead. And of course here, the idea was to have a nice, shiny building, and it's a nice building, and I like the atrium over here, but there are too many offices where you would say, I don't want to work in an office where people can watch me. So I was here this morning at 7:30, and there was one guy in his office, and I said, well, I'm sure he doesn't know that I'm here and I can see him now, so let's just disappear before he does things that he will regret knowing that I'm here. You know, things like that. But that's the trust. The second moral support good is trust. And it's almost the most important good that you manage in working with other human beings. So let's briefly talk about trust. And before we talk about trust, I open the space for any footnotes from your side. Any comments, footnotes? Complaints? Any extra words moving forward? Do you know the feeling of a washing machine in front of a cat? No. A cat. It's a question. If you knew, you would have an insight into my current state of mind. Yes. So far, so good? Van Andre? Yes? So if I died right now, what would be your last words to me before I died? Before? Yeah. No, maybe. If I died at... It's 4:34. If I died at 4:35, what would you say to me now?
You're a very good guy, and good professional, and also I hope so that all of us are very happy that you share at least this like small knowledge of you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that's good. Thank you, Van Andre. That was impressive. And I'm so glad it was recorded. Last words. You know, they just in brackets, they created a new format, the first lecture. Do you know the last lecture, Randy Pausch? So there was this American, what was he? He was like a software designer, I think Randy Pausch was. No, he was a professor, but I think his field was creating software for computer games. And then he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and knew he had only a few weeks to live. And he decided to give a last lecture. And quite often, as you know, we have this last lecture at the end of a person's career before retirement. In his case, it was really literally a last lecture. And he wrote a book about it, what he said and how he prepared. It's a powerful book, Last Lecture. And the Q School will start in the fall a first lecture series for parents, I don't even know for whom, for parents and for students, first-year students, to give them a first lecture. I prefer the last lecture, last words, and then because the first lecture is, yes. There's this famous idea, the first words in a novel determine the relationship between the author and the reader. Not that you're interested in that, that's not our point. Okay, if you have no footnotes, let me talk about trust. So all these moral goods, integrity, respect, self-respect, freedom, fruitful difference, mission, common good, recognition, and future need to be supported by trust. And it's really one of those most precious goods in a social context. If people don't trust you and don't trust each other, things become complicated and expensive, and it's just a nuisance. Economically speaking, trust reduces transaction costs. And so, is this your laptop, Father Pavel? That's such a sign of trust, isn't it? I mean, Father Pavel even left the room and left the laptop here. I would never do that because my laptop is like my second wife, kind of, you know. So, ooh, you know? Yeah. Don't run around without your laptop. Anyway, so what's a good definition of trust? Oh, look at this. Oops. Yeah, I was afraid this was it. Trust. Philosophically speaking, right, what you always wanted to know about trust from a philosophical perspective. I don't like this. There was a better one. Where's the better one? It fell down. Oh, here. Oh, the good ones always fall down and the bad ones stay alive. Right? Good people die young. Right? Yeah. Philosophically speaking. Trust. Much better, right? It's so good that you're back here. X trusts Y, that's an S, trusts, wow. If and only if X hands A over to Y. A is important to X. Y could damage / destroy A. There is no guarantee that Y would not, and then damage or destroy A. So I don't have the nerves for that now. So that's trust. X trusts Y if and only if X hands A over to Y. A is important to X. Y could damage or destroy A, and there is no guarantee that Y would not damage or destroy A. That's when we need trust. So children, you give your child to a babysitter. You give your child to the babysitter. Your child, if you're old-fashioned, is important to you, right? The babysitter could damage or even destroy the child. There is no guarantee that this would not happen. That's when you need to trust. And the same with you invite a speaker. And the Nanovic Institute always invites speakers, and there's always this risk, the reputational risk. I mean, if we invite an idiot and the speaker turns out to be an idiot, it's not good for the institute. And so we always ask speakers, are you an idiot? Question mark, and then check the box, yes or no. But that's trust. And the point here is there is no guarantee. There's always a risk involved. There's always a risk involved and values at stake. What you hand over is precious. What you hand over is precious. So Father Pavel left the laptop here, and it's only trust if he cares about the laptop. If he says, well, who cares about the laptop? That's a different story. But otherwise, Father Pavel left the laptop here on the table. It's let's say, important to him. Anybody can walk by, take it or damage it or destroy it. I'm always, in the library in Notre Dame, I'm always surprised what students leave behind. And I say, God bless them. God bless them. I just hope that their trust will not be shattered at some point, which can go very quickly. Which is another important lesson about trust. It takes a lot of time to build trust, and trust can disappear very quickly. A Scottish-British example, looking at Julie, or at the game that you're watching. Do you remember the year 2010 and Gordon Brown's election campaign in England? Well, why would you? But I was at King's College London at the time. And Gordon Brown and Gillian Duffy, yeah. So Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister at the time, was in the election campaign, and he had an encounter with a 66-year-old stout Labour voter, Gillian Duffy. And they talked about the Polish immigrants in England. Sorry, that's what they talked about. And she complained about, so many foreigners in England, including the Austrians. And he said, well, good to talk to you. And then he sat down in his car, and he complained about Gillian Duffy. Oh, what a bore, who set it up? And he forgot that the mic was still there. And that was at 10 o'clock in the morning, and at 12 noon, he was at the BBC radio station, and they were so cruel. They confronted him, and he didn't know about that, with the live recording. Mr. Prime Minister, just 2 hours ago you said this about one of your voters. What a bore, who set it up? Not good, not good. I was in London at the time, and then there was an article in the newspaper that Gordon Brown had spent, I forgot the exact numbers, but let's say 20 minutes in Parliament to talk about the Iraq War, 30 minutes in the White House to talk about the Near East peace, and 44 minutes at Gillian Duffy's house to apologize. And there were these voter analysis after the election, and that had really an impact. We are stupid. We voters are stupid. We trust, anyway. But trust can be really, you can lose it quickly. You can lose it quickly. And so it's one of those precious goods. It takes a lot of time to build, and it can get lost very quickly. And so one of the questions, these are the questions that Monica sent me, right? Questions that Monica sent me. One of the questions here is how to repair or re-establish trust if trust has been broken. How to repair or re-establish trust if trust has been broken. And obviously I have no idea, I can tell you what the literature says. And the literature says, acknowledge that something went wrong. Number one, acknowledge that something went wrong. Number two, explain why it went wrong. Number 3, apologize. Number 4, make structural efforts that this will not happen again. And number 5, offer compensation. And this can happen on different levels. But in medical ethics, when you look at medical errors in a hospital, again, institutional ethics, a hospital loses a lot of trust if people know. It's like the AstraZeneca vaccine in Europe. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people vaccinated, and then maybe 6 people die, who would have died maybe 2 weeks afterwards. Anyway, different story. And then, of course, if people get this message, then the trust in AstraZeneca is gone. And I know it from Austria. Many people did not show up to the vaccination appointments because of they don't trust AstraZeneca. And they wanted to wait until they had a choice. And then, of course, you had some Johnson & Johnson, negative news, and trust. So in institutional ethics, the point here is if something happens that damages the reputation of a hospital, like a medical error, acknowledge that it happened, explain why it happened, apologize, make structural adjustments that minimize the probability of this happening again, and compensate without being forced to. And we had a study in 2010 on trust repair at the Center for Poverty and Ethics, where I worked at the time. And it was financed by financial institutions, banks. After the crash, 2008, 2009, there was a loss of need for trust repair of banks, financial institutions. And the studies produced 2 very simple messages. One is simplicity, and the other is supererogatory action. Simplicity, meaning if you lost trust and you want to re-establish trust, have a very simple message that you can credibly repeat and repeat. Simplicity. Don't make things complicated. The message must be something like, we screwed up, we apologize, we'll do better in the future. Simple, consistent, repeated. And the second is supererogatory actions. Do you understand supererogatory? I didn't ask Grant. Supererogatory. It's one of my favorite words. I cannot pronounce it, but it sounds so learned, you know, when you sit with people and you say, oh, this was supererogatory. You know, it's kind of, and they think it's an insult, but it shouldn't be an insult. It means it is an ethically beautiful action that cannot be an obligation, beyond the obligation, beyond what can be reasonably expected from a person. Because in ethics, we distinguish, as you know, what is an obligation, what is prohibited, and then you have this category of supererogatory, which is also, by the way, an interesting management question, where to draw the line, where to draw the line between an obligation and supererogatory. Where to draw the line. Obligation, supererogatory. Many conflicts can arise if this is not clear. So I was in London when they tripled the tuition fees from one year to the next. Ridiculous amounts by American standards, but it's real money, from £3,000 to £9,000. And what happened was that the students changed their attitudes and expectations, and rightly so. And what used to be supererogatory became an expectation. And the higher the tuition fee, the more people will expect and see as your obligation. And I remember that they at the King's College London told us there's a rule now, you have to respond to each student's email within 48 hours. And you know, they communicated that 48 hours, and then the question was weekend included, weekend not included. So do you have an obligation to be accessible on the weekend? And we had a discussion here at the Nanovic Institute, an explicit discussion about that, where we said, if something comes to our mind on the weekend, I rather want to send it before I forget it, and I rather want to avoid these complicated things that Monica understands so well, to write it now and send it 2 days afterwards. I had a student, you know, who sent me an email in the first class. The first class was August last year. And he said, I just sent you an email. And I said, well, yeah, I haven't received it. Yeah, you will see it in May. You know, at the end of the academic calendar year, he programmed it. Anyway, some people, young people, technology generation, they do things. But the point here is, it should be clear. And we said at the Nanovic Institute, please allow me to send the email on the weekend, but I don't expect anyone to respond to that on the weekend unless there is an emergency. We did have an emergency in March 2020 when we had to, and NDI knows it very well, to get the students back from Europe safely to the US, because Donald Trump had this amazing idea on the Wednesday that Friday midnight nobody would be, anyway. And then there was an emergency. You had to respond quickly. But other than that, it was very clear there is no obligation to be available on the weekend. And that's a big, big problem if you have your laptops and your cell phones with you all the time, that there is this hidden expectation. I want you to be available 24/7. And it will not reflect well on your merit increase, on your promotion, if you are not. And this has to be clarified. It has to be clarified. And it has to be honestly clarified. Because the problem here is, if we put supererogatory in the merit pool, we exhaust or we weaken the idea of obligation. And then we push more and more as hidden obligations into the supererogatory, which is just a management issue. So this is part of the trust repair strategy, offers something that is beyond what could be reasonably expected. And that's not what we normally do. So these are my ideas about moral support goods, infrastructure, and trust. Any comments on that? Integrity is good for trust. Credibility is good for trust. Reliability is good for trust. Predictability is good for trust. Keeping promises is good for trust. Yeah, there's even literature on broken promise management. If you break a promise, it's not good, but it's not the end of the world if you acknowledge, apologize, and try to compensate. And also very simple, don't promise things that you are probably not able to respect. Don't do that. Good. Challenges. Dignity-based management, as I would like to present it, is the coordination of integrity-protecting processes and integrity-enhancing practices to achieve explicit and specific dignity-based goals. So the goals that we have should be compatible with human dignity, which is also not always the case. Now, there are certain challenges with this approach, and I mentioned one. And the one I mentioned was, exam question. It starts with an S. Standardization. Yes. So disappointing. You ask yourself, what have I done? Okay, one of the challenges with the dignity-based approach is management invests in standardizing processes and using categories that are applied to everybody. Forms. I believe, and the priest here can help me with that in paradise, as it is described in the book of Genesis, there was no bureaucracy and no forms. So I think it came after the fall. And forms came after the fall, and our salvation history with Jesus Christ begins with forms. And they had to enter these lists of taxpayers. I mean, yeah. So I'm what's the word I'm looking for? Honest opponent and skeptic of forms. But I realize they are important. But the problem of forms is they don't allow uniqueness and individual space. So there is an intrinsic conflict between forms and human dignity, you could say. And that's a challenge in management. And I would like to respond to that in the following way. Subsidiarity is an important, so standardization. And the response to standardization would be subsidiarity. You know what subsidiarity means? If you have a hierarchy of structures, put a maximum of freedom and a maximum of responsibility in the lowest possible level. One term that I find helpful in this regard is the term job crafting. Job crafting, that's a Z-N-R-A-F-T-I-N-G. Job crafting means that people can craft their job to a certain significant extent. So they can inhabit the space so that the way you inhabit your role is unique, and the way another person would inhabit the same role would be different. Job crafting. Allow a person to inhabit the space. And it goes back to what we said about Michael Marmot, about freedom. Allow people to deviate from standardization within certain acceptable limits. And we realize, I mean, here in Notre Dame, we have a very unforgiving software where people have to write their reports and their performance reports, and yeah, exactly. The way to individualize that is the one-on-one conversation, not the form, not the software, but the way you introduce it and talk about it. So that would be my response to that. A second challenge is regulation. Regulation. Management likes rules and regulation, and that's part of managing. I talked about rules. Trying to fight arbitrariness, be predictable and reliable. So you need rules. However, rules sometimes miss the point. And if you remember, one aspect of hell was absurdity, loss of meaning. And from a dignity perspective, we have to be suspicious of rules that create what I could call self-referential actions. Self-referential actions are actions that are not meaningful in the eyes of those who perform them, but there is an external reason. Let's put it this way, there's no internal value, but only an external reason. I'll give you an example. I once took a group of students to Austria and southern Germany to look at Holocaust memorial sites. Or was it the trip? Yeah, I think it was this one. Holocaust memorial sites, and we have a risk management session, unit at the university, and we had to undergo a risk management session before we departed, 8 students and I. And in the risk management session, the person doing it, lovely person by the way, talked about what to do if there is an earthquake in Austria or a terrorist attack or a volcano eruption. And I was intrigued by the volcano eruption idea. And I told her, you know, whatever you tell me now, if there is such a thing, like an earthquake or a terrorist attack or volcano eruption in Salzburg, Austria, I would panic. And I would make sure that the students panic too, because I mean, they should know that this is really serious, right? And her response was, I know, but it's so important that we say we did it if something happens. Meaning, she says, I know this session is useless, but it's important that we say we did that. If people sue Notre Dame, so we check the box. And she did the right thing, Notre Dame does the right thing, it's a legal thing. We created a legal context where we have to be able to say we did this, we did this. It's like when we enter the country, I mean, we US, are you a member of a terrorist group? Yeah. Do I proudly say, yes, I'm a Catholic? No. You know, I say, no. And are you bringing drugs? And you know, things like that. So, and again, they would tell you, of course, those who have things to hide will lie, but it's very important for us to be able to say, you had your chance to tell us the truth. That's the point. And that's what I call self-referential actions. And from a dignity perspective, try to minimize those points where people will not see the value of what they do, because it's only externally driven but not internally motivated. Yeah. Another challenge of management is that you have goals that are not the ultimate goals. And obviously, the Nanovic Institute is a small unit, and we have certain financial goals, and we don't write in our strategic plan ad majorem Dei gloriam. We don't do that. We could still think about it, but we don't do that. So one challenge from a dignity perspective is, the big goal is, from a secular perspective, respect the dignity of the human person. From a Christian perspective is really, I mean, follow Christ and ad majorem Dei gloriam. And here, my response to that would be, dignity-based management would at least ask the big question, what's the point of our life and how does this point connect to our little unit? So I would encourage us to ask these questions. What's the connection between Jesus Christ and our unit? Jesus Christ and this decision. There was a bishop here in the Diocese of Saginaw, Michigan, Kenneth Antoner, and he said, after each meeting, I want people to ask the question, what's the connection between this meeting and the poor? If they say there's no connection, at least they ask the question. So asking these big questions, I think, is such an important exercise when you run a department or a faculty, that you don't fall into the trap of thinking that the preservation of the unit is the highest purpose. We have 2 more minutes left, so I want to end on a positive note, but I have to squeeze in a negative note before. If you look at a number of those sexual child abuse reports, many, be it the Philadelphia report, be it the Pennsylvania report, be it the Murphy report, beat the one from the Archdiocese of Cologne. The message is those involved protected the reputation of the institution rather than the well-being of the victims. And there are good reasons why you try to protect the reputation of the unit. There are good reasons, and it's part of your job description as a manager. But it cannot be the ultimate goal. It cannot be the ultimate goal. Let alone in the long run, it's not good for an institution either. Be the hospital, be the Catholic Church. So that's where this question, what's the ultimate goal, is so important. On a positive note, on my last minute, I would like to say this. One good way to try to practice dignity-based management is not to take yourself too seriously. And we sometimes say that humor is the ability to deal with the imperfect. And let me end with a non-Christian term, wabi-sabi. Do you know the term wabi-sabi? It's a Japanese term, and it comes with the spirituality. It's the ability to recognize the beauty in the imperfect. It was introduced in a Japanese tea ceremony by a tea master who celebrated the tea ceremony with some broken dishes, which was unheard of because the tea ceremony became more and more complicated. And so it's a spirituality to recognize the beauty in the imperfect. And what we said before about perfectionism may feed into that. If you see the beauty in the imperfect, in things that did not go as planned, you will be much more relaxed to deal with the things that cannot be managed. And as we know, we are wounded and vulnerable human beings, which is part of our human dignity. So wabi-sabi may be a good approach to management. 5 o'clock, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your life. Yes, and it's so important to end on time. It's 5:00, we end now. It's very important to end on time. Okay, thank you so much. Have a good evening. Thank you.